Welcome, everyone, to the 92nd Street Y's 8th State of America Summit. I'm Seth Pinsky, CEO here at 92NY, and I'm honored to open today's program. We gather at a time when the future of our country is less certain than it has been in many years. Political identity in America has fractured, and unity often feels out of reach. Today's summit asks a simple but profound question. What will it take to chart a new vision for America that brings our country together? To help us to explore that question, we'll hear from leading political thinkers, journalists and strategists, and others on the front lines of our new political era. Together, they'll examine some of the forces buffeting our democracy, the ideological rifts dividing Republicans, the generational strategic debates among Democrats, and the widening gulf between urban and rural voters. These fractures aren't just shaping our politics, they're shaping our future. For more than 150 years, 92NY has stood at the intersection of culture, civic life, and ideas, serving as a trusted platform for dialogue at moments when dialogue is most needed. Fostering critical conversations about who we are and where we're going remains at the core of 92NY's mission and at the core of the State of America Summit. Today's program is part of the Newmark Civic Life series, made possible through the generous support of Craig Newmark Philanthropies. We thank them for their support, and we also want to acknowledge an associated initiative, Take 9, a public service cybersecurity campaign created by Craig Newmark Philanthropies that is working to safeguard our nation's security. Craig's vision of a civically engaged, informed, and secure democracy resonates deeply with the work we do here at 92NY. And now, let's get started. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a day of vital conversations.
Hey, I'm Craig Newmark, probably best known as the guy who started something called Craigslist. I'm also the lead sponsor of the Civic Life series here at the 92nd Street Y in New York. American politics has a lot of problems you don't need me to repeat to you. Today's State of American Summit is about figuring out how to improve things for everyone. We need movement towards making things better, like the Take 9 effort about fighting scams and cyber attacks. You're going to hear from people who think a lot about how do we help the whole country out. This isn't just another event, it's part of serious work about helping the whole country out. By showing up, by listening, by asking better questions, you're becoming part of that work. Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Hannah Doba from News Nation. This is the split within the Republican Party. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Tara Setmayer is a co-founder of the Seneca Project and resident scholar for the University of Virginia for Center of Politics. And David French, columnist for the New York Times and senior editor at the Dispatch, a constitutional lawyer and longtime conservative thinker. I'm really excited to talk to both of you. Tara, I will start with you. You've publicly said that the Republican Party has become unrecognizable than the one you joined years ago. How would you describe what the GOP stands for today, and who is it really speaking to?
Thank you so much for having me. And as someone who spent 30 years in politics and came into the political realm, a very wide-eyed, bushy-tailed young Republican in the 90s, it really has pained me to see the change in the party over the last 10 or so years, particularly with the entree of Donald Trump and MAGA politics. And when I say it's unrecognizable today, I would say that it does not represent it's not your father's or grandfather's Republican Party. It's not even probably your uncle's Republican Party of the George W. Bush days. I mean, it is considerably different in that the party has taken a nationalist populist turn. It's anti-immigration to the point where we are hostile now to immigrants, unlike President Reagan, who was very pro-immigration. It's an isolationist party now. That was not also the foreign policy, not the foreign policy that I grew up with under Reagan and Bush. We've become a party of cruelty and indecency. And those are all things that were very concerning to me when I saw the acceptance of Donald Trump, much to the chagrin, given that many of the positions he took, just policy wise, take the character issue out of it, were antithetical to what I grew up believing the Republican Party stood for. I came from the compassionate conservative wing of the party, and there is no compassion anymore inside the Republican Party under Donald Trump 1 and 2. It's gotten considerably worse, where cruelty seems to be the point, which is why I made the decision to leave the party in 2020, one of many.
David, you've written that the GOP is suffering from a split personality. You've said it's torn between voters who crave stability and a base that feeds on disruption. Is that split permanent? Do you think it can be reconciled?
Yeah, right now the split is temporary because it has to be temporary, because the Republican Party is going to have to figure out what it really stands for other than supporting Donald Trump. Right now, the Republican Party won. It won in 2024 by really only having one ideological litmus test, and that was, could you put on the red hat? Everything else was less important than that. So you had pro-vaccine folks in the Republican Party and anti-vaccine. You had pro-NATO folks and anti-NATO folks. You had people who wanted to bomb Iran and people who didn't want to bomb Iran. You had people on every side of every issue, pro-life, pro-choice. But so long as they put on the red hat, they were welcome in the coalition. And so if you looked at sort of an ideological chart of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in 2024, the Democratic Party ideologically was much narrower than the Republican Party. The Republican Party had engineered, basically by taking kind of every disaffected and alienated subculture in the US and saying, this is your home, this is your new home. So you had everything from the isolationists who are trying to rethink what World War II meant, to like homeschooled moms who treat the flu with essential oils. And you combine all of those people into one coalition and with one condition, and that's the red hat. What happens when there's no Donald Trump anymore? You have a lot of people with incompatible worldviews. There will be a fight, and somebody's going to have to win that. It cannot continue to be that expansive when the unifying force is gone. At the same time, however, the Democrats have their own work to do to broaden their own coalition. They narrowed their ideological coalition at the same time the Republicans broadened it. And it's one of the reasons why the Democrats lost the popular vote for the first time since 2004. If you narrow your coalition, eventually you're going to narrow yourself out of a majority. But the Republicans broadened it so much that it's really hard to know what they're going to stand for going forward, because it is far from clear to me which faction of MAGA, pro-Epstein, releasing Epstein files, against releasing Epstein files. I mean, you can do this all day. It is far from clear to me which of these MAGA factions is going to triumph on any given issue. And also, I will say that the infighting you see in MAGA is vicious. It is vicious. It's often hidden by the fact that everyone unites and rallies around Donald Trump. So it can create this facade of unity because it's all around Donald Trump. But you go one layer below Donald Trump, whether it's talking about Pam Bondi or Pete Hegseth or you name it, the infighting can be unreal. And so once Trump is gone, the infighting is what will remain. And it is far from clear how that's going to work out.
David calls it a split personality. You've called it a moral collapse. Are you describing the same party or two different GOPs?
No, I think it's all part of the overall collapse and personality schizophrenia of the Republican Party now. It's become more increasingly clear that MAGA is the dominant part of the Republican Party. The traditional establishment Republicans that David and I probably grew up on is pretty much dead and gone. All of those people who had the opportunity to stand up on ideological grounds and say, wait, hold on, this is not what we believe. These are not Republican principles, certainly not conservative principles. We're not okay with this. Most of those people are either gone or they've made the conscious decision to sell out and go along with Donald Trump in order to stay in power. One of the first things you learn in political science 101 is that elected officials are single seekers of re-election. And it's clear that a lot of people who knew better and still do today, made the conscious decision to swear fealty and loyalty to Donald Trump, as opposed to being honest about where they stand ideologically and where they feel as though there are things going on in the party that are so anathema that Ronald Reagan today would not make it out of a Republican primary. So I don't think we're talking about two different parties. I think we're talking about what the party has morphed into. It is a perversion of what the traditional Republican orthodoxy used to be. And the fact that there are factions within MAGA now, because it is so MAGA dominant, that they are, that there are different levels of the infighting. It's not really necessarily on policy grounds. It really is about a purity test of loyalty to Donald Trump, which has turned the party into a cult-like entity. We've said this for a long time, but if there's any indication that the party we really don't know what they believe in beyond what Donald Trump happens to say that day, it's been evidenced by his behavior in his second term, where the Project 2025 has overtaken a lot of what would have been traditional Republican policies into something that is often unrecognizable to a lot of us who were traditional Republicans.
The populist right has energized millions of voters who felt ignored. It's also pulled the party away from some of its core conservative ideals that both of you have alluded to. Is populism a revival of Republican authenticity or a replacement of it?
It is both. So if you look at the long history of the right, what you're going to see are time periods where the right was very reactionary populist. And in the United States. I mean, you can go back and you can look at the McCarthy era, for example, as a time when that was a manifestation of the right and the Republican Party. Then you had, after that, the Goldwater/Reagan revolution that really turned it in a much more libertarian direction, to such an extent that, if you look at some of the Reagan initiatives, as Tara was just saying, now and through the eyes of the modern GOP, he wouldn't get 5% of a primary vote. I mean, this is somebody who was very welcoming to immigrants, for example. One of the first real large-scale amnesties, an amnesty in his second term. So very welcoming to immigrants. His closing remarks at the end of his second term, once again, extremely welcoming to immigrants. He was very much an internationalist, very much committed to extending our foreign alliances. He was also somebody who believed in more limited government, even though, with the push and pull with the Democratic-controlled Congress, there wasn't always less spending in the Reagan Revolution. There was at least an orientation to be skeptical of government power. I mean, Reagan famously said, some of the most dangerous words in the English language, or worrisome words in the English language, or someone saying, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. So there was this sense that the government doesn't always help, that there should be less governmental authority. All of that stuff is completely out of step with the current Republican Party. So this is something where, and there's even more social welfare legislation. It was Reagan who guaranteed that everybody could get health care in the United States if they went to an emergency room, regardless of their ability to pay. So a lot of these things are the old Republican Party, but then what's replacing it is the older Republican Party in some ways. And I think it's very important to note that there has always been reactionary populism in the US. Always. You can go back and you can look at Huey Long, for example, in the South, or you can look at some of the segregationist politicians in the civil rights era. The reactionary populism is an old part of the American political story. Let's go back to Andrew Jackson, reactionary populism. But its political identity, whether it's locating itself in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or in a third party like the George Wallace runs in the late 60s and early 70s, that has been somewhat variable. But what we have now is reactionary populism is now almost entirely located within one party, within the Republican Party. And I don't think people have quite appreciated, because we're still a 50-50 nation, how much of a political realignment we've had. The Republican coalition is not made up of entirely the same people that it was made up of 20, 25 years ago. And so there are very good reasons for the changes when you look at it like that. It's a much more working class party. It's a much less well-educated party. A lot of the educated Republicans have moved over to the Democratic Party. So now the Democratic Party is much more of the party of the educated and much less the party of the working class, which a lot of Democrats haven't fully absorbed that change. And so you've had a migration, you've had a swapping out of constituencies in some really interesting ways. And so the Republican Party is just fundamentally different. And it's so different to the point where if somebody looks at me now and says, "What happened to you, David?" Like, why aren't you Republican? I'm just thinking you haven't paid the slightest bit of attention to anything that's happened in the last decade, because the Republican Party has transformed itself yet again. It is a very different party than it was under Reagan, and it's more like the party it was with McCarthy, although even there it was less purely reactionary populist because you had Eisenhower as a Republican. So yes, I would put it this way, it's new and it's the same. It just depends on which era you're looking at.
All right. Is populism the cause or the consequence of the GOP's identity crisis?
Well, I think that's a good question. You could probably argue both sides of that. I think it would be, well, to David's point, these things are cyclical. I would argue that the party today resembles more of what it was like under Nixon in some ways, because of the level of corruption, the level of drunken power, the overemphasis on law and order, exploiting racial tropes and things. Now, at least Richard Nixon still had enough respect for the Constitution to step aside, and the oath of office to step aside when it was time, recognizing his ways. And there were still Republicans who were willing to hold him to account. So there were still institutions that held. Some of the democratic norms and institutions were still in place. Today, clearly those are out the window. There are no more guardrails within the party. There hasn't been anyone within the party to stand up and say, yell, "Stop athwart history," when no one else would, which is what Bill Buckley, one of the grandfathers of the modern conservative movement, said was the role of conservatives. So there hasn't been anyone to do that. If anything, those people who were supposed to be the bulwark have acquiesced in ways that was surprising to me and probably to David as well, and disappointing. And that's kind of how we got here. So it's a lot of the enablers. They saw the populism, people like Steve Bannon and the MAGA movement saw the populism and the attraction to that, the economic populism mixed in with the racial resentment as a mechanism to accelerate their path to power and to consolidate power. And I think that that's where, when you see in modern history in the 20th century, how fascist movements and authoritarian movements are born, oftentimes it exploits those types of concerns from people who feel as though the government's not representing them, or that these others are coming in to replace them or taking from them. It thrives on fear of the other, and populism is the common denominator with how a lot of those movements caused reigns of terror on the average person. Populism doesn't really mesh well. Nationalist populism doesn't mesh well with an open democracy or a constitutional republic at that. So we're seeing that struggle between those that movement and those forces, and what we are defending as our constitutional republic, and the balance of power that we're supposed to have. I mean, that has been completely thrown away, which is another difference, that this populism has overtaken what our constitutional republic was supposed to avoid. Our founding fathers were concerned about this. This is why we have 3 branches of government. It's why we have the Bill of Rights. That's why we have things to try to balance that out, to avoid straight populism taking over a representative government like we have, and just the idea of the bicameral system that we have. All of those things, the genius of our founding fathers, they put that in place to try to avoid what we have now. I don't think they anticipated, or where we're headed right now under Donald Trump. I don't think they anticipated that the American people would so quickly acquiesce to this imperial overreach coming from this executive overreach coming from the presidency, or that Congress would neuter itself in such a way that they would not bring a balance to what the executive is doing. I think that is probably one of the things that a lot of us who are observing this in horror are upset about, because we were supposed to have checks and balances here that's prevented what Donald Trump and the executive branch is doing. Right now, we have the courts that seem to be that bulwark for now, but the Supreme Court and the makeup of the Supreme Court, a lot of their rulings giving Trump more power as the president, the immunity rulings, and all of those things have all seemed to fuel his response to this populist outrage to various things, whether it's economics or racial, that I think that's part of the challenge now as we're looking at how do we move forward? What does it look like? That populism can be very, very dangerous. And we've seen where that's ended up in history in the past.
I'm going to move on to foreign policy. I will start with you on this question, Tara. Foreign policy, another test, whether we're talking about Ukraine, NATO, China. We're watching the ideological divide between the America First thought process along with traditional relationships with world allies. Can those two wings coexist in a single party, or is one destined to dominate the GOP's foreign policy identity?
Oh, I don't think that there is a way for them to coexist. We saw what it looked like when they coexisted in the first Trump administration, where you still had more traditional establishment foreign policy folks in positions, important positions throughout the government. Many of those people, I would argue all of them, are gone now. And so the idea of America being the shining city on a hill, being the world's greatest democracy, something that people aspire to, we have seen the United States fall from that perch. And because for a few reasons. One, Donald Trump doesn't have a foreign policy other than a transactional relationship. What can you do for me? America First is something, it's an old phrase. Again, to David's point, things come back around. You know, we heard the term America First back in the 1930s in the run up to World War II. It kept us out of getting involved with what was happening with Nazi Germany and what was going on in Europe back then. It was, oh no, America First. It was an isolationist worldview. But there's inconsistencies even with the America First policy. We just bailed out Argentina with $20 billion at a time when the United States government was shut down, and our farmers are reeling from tariffs, which is something else, which is very much against what Republicans believe, despite what they try to say about Ronald Reagan. He wanted to use them strategically. He would never have been in favor of what Trump is doing now. But how is that America First? How is it America First when Donald Trump is personally enriching himself and his personal companies by doing deals overseas with countries that we would never have done business with, given their human rights violations and the level of corruption? Like, how is that America First? How is being so isolationist in world trade? How is that America First when it's hurting our agriculture communities in ways that we haven't seen in quite some time, that would require federal subsidies to bail them out? How is it America First when the tariff policies to punish other countries, when it's actually punishing American citizens and American consumers as a tax, is hurting the American family, when affordability was supposed to be one of the reasons why Donald Trump got elected, to change that? A lot of the idea, the America First, sounds great for a bumper sticker or to put on a hat, but in practice, it is actually quite the opposite in policy. So when we look at foreign policy now, these countries recognize that America is no longer a reliable ally. They're no longer a stakeholder in seeing democracy and freedom across the world thrive. The way to ingratiate yourself to the American president is to heap praise on him, tell him what he wants to hear, flatter him, and find out what's a transactional way to get along with him. We're seeing this in so many places. Our NATO allies are scared to death that Donald Trump is going to withdraw the United States from NATO, which would ultimately collapse that alliance and hand power over to Vladimir Putin, who is an enemy of the United States, an enemy of the West, someone that Donald Trump speaks favorably of. So this is, the world is looking at us going, what the hell happened to the United States? And the shining city on a hill example, and knowing that the United States would be a reliable partner and soft power around the world. We've seen a lot of that also be destroyed with Donald Trump's reckless DOGE policies and taking foreign aid away from places that matter. And China fills that void. So I'm not sure how those two sides coexist, because the dominant side, clearly, based on who Donald Trump has installed and who a lot of Republican senators who, once again, know better, let people get confirmed, the policy that they're executing does not allow for both of those worldviews to coexist at the same time.
And many have argued that the GOP's retreat from global leadership is dangerous. You've argued it's a necessary reset. So which vision wins, and at what cost?
That's a phenomenal question. Which vision wins? Don't know. We don't know which vision is going to win. Here's the way I would put our current foreign policy situation, and that is that the American people don't really know fully what they want in foreign policy, and that's a consistent problem. And therefore, populism is always going to be very, very erratic when it comes to foreign policy, because you're going to be jolting and moving from one crisis to another without a coherent theory or philosophy. That's why you see Trump do things that seemingly contradict each other all the time. He says, I'm not going to have any new wars except for bombing Iran or for attacking Venezuela. I'm totally against the way Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, except it was a deal that I negotiated. You have all of this back and forth. And the reason is that unless you have your own foreign policy vision, if you are gauging your foreign policy to sort of popular reaction, it's just going to be all over the place. I think the Afghan withdrawal is a perfect illustration of this phenomenon. Most Americans wanted to end that war. They did not want to lose that war, okay? So you have these two visions. One is America doesn't want to be in this war, and the other one is America doesn't want to lose the war. Well, it turns out that those were two completely incompatible views held together. Because if you want to end it, you're going to lose it. If you don't want to lose it, then you're not going to end it. And so which of those values mattered the most? Which one mattered the most? Well, when push comes to shove, Biden found out that the I don't want to lose the war value was bigger than the I don't want to end the war, because he lost his positive approval rating in that withdrawal, and it never came back. It never came back. So on the one hand, he did what he thought America wanted him to do, which was withdraw from Afghanistan, and then got punished by the American people for it. And so this is something that comes up again and again in foreign policy, which is why the best presidents have always come into office with their own vision of foreign policy, have stuck to that vision, and then asked the American people to adjudicate the results and to say, did this vision work? As opposed to the more reactionary populist view, which really is driven by the direction of the wind. Did Vladimir Putin disrespect Donald Trump too much? Well, in a normal foreign policy, that should be an irrelevant question, because Americans' national interests do not change depending on whether Vladimir Putin is rude or not rude, for example, or depending on whether Volodymyr Zelensky is appropriately obsequious or not appropriately obsequious in the Oval Office. That's what populism does. It looks at a news cycle and it says, I'm mad at Zelensky for disrespecting our president, and turns against Ukraine, regardless of the underlying strategy. Or it looks at Putin and goes, well, Zelensky was disrespectful, but not as disrespectful as Vladimir Putin, so now I'm with Ukraine. That's not a strategy at all, but that's what populism is. But to the extent that there is an underlying strategy, it isn't actually isolationism. It would be what you would call spheres of influence. That if push comes to shove, if you want to really drill down to where is Donald Trump on foreign policy after 10 long years, the first thing you're going to know, well, the first thing about foreign policy is Donald Trump wants to look good while he's doing foreign policy. He wants to be seen as a winner. So whatever he has to do to be perceived as a winner in the moment, he's going to push that. He's going to do that. However, secondary behind that, if there's any underlying philosophy behind that I have to be seen as winning in every confrontation, it's going to be spheres of influence. Vladimir Putin, he's entitled to dominate the countries around him. China's entitled to dominate the countries around it. And we in America are entitled to dominate the countries around us. So if you want to know where did it come from that when Donald Trump becomes president again, first thing he does foreign policy wise is he goes after Canada and Mexico with tariffs. It's craziness. What did Canada and Mexico do to us that earned that kind of punitive action? Well, the reality is you see in Trump that he believes that Canada and Mexico are essentially subordinate institutions to the United States. And so what he wants them to do, they should do or be punished. It's one of the reasons why you look at Ukraine, and early on when Putin invaded, he called it brilliant. Why? He believes that Putin has a right to bring these countries to heel. So what do you have? It's sort of the worst of all possible worlds in the sense that you have a populism that's very erratic, but to the extent there's anything consistent underlying it, it's the kind of spheres of influence, great power, multipolar world that brought us to such horrible calamities as World War I and World War II. And so, but that's not to say that he can't achieve individual diplomatic successes. Securing the release of all the hostages, for example, out of Gaza was a diplomatic success. It's not the diplomatic success they're proclaiming it to be. This is a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange. It is not a peace deal. Those are very different things. A peace deal may happen, but right now it looks like Hamas is consolidating control. But he does deserve credit for a ceasefire and a prisoner exchange. So it's not as if you can't do anything correctly. It's just that you can't do anything reliably. And when it comes to foreign policy, the inability to have any sort of reliable, coherent strategy is always going to bite you in the long run. Always, even if you have some isolated successes here and there.
Actually a very good segue to my next question, David. I will start with you. The GOP split isn't just ideological, it's behavioral. The incentives have shifted. Governing doesn't always get attention. Outrage seems to. Is the modern Republican Party rewarding performance over policy?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And a great way to know that is how much the modern Republican Party is loving the executive orders passed by Trump and not pressing Congress to change laws. Now, why do I make that distinction? Because think of executive orders as the closest thing you're going to ever have to performance as policy. Because an executive order of all of the legal documents you can have coming out of this executive, legislative, judicial, of all of the branches of government, the most ephemeral, least permanent, least binding form of action is an executive order. It's less binding than a regulation. It's way less binding than a statute. It's far less binding than a Supreme Court opinion. But how much of Trump's actions in the second term have been manifested through these executive orders? They're often far more bark than they are bite. Any policy change that they achieve is completely temporary, easily reversible by the next president, just at the stroke of a pen. And so if it really was diving into the kind of permanent, revolutionary, drain the swamp change that they claim to want, Congress would be a lot busier than it is right now. It would be reforming immigration comprehensively. It would be reforming foreign aid comprehensively. It would be reforming the various authorizations on the use of military force. There's so many things Congress could be doing if there was a very, very serious governing program. But what we have is a performance program that manifests itself obviously in some certain, sometimes very decisive ways, such as the very, very aggressive ways that ICE is interacting in communities. But it's all quite ephemeral. It's all stuff that the next president can undo just almost instantaneously. And so this is where with Trump, performance does merge into policy and policy merges into performance in a way that I think you can't replicate, or you have not seen replicated in any other modern president. Other modern presidents, when they want to achieve lasting, major lasting change, they have done it with Congress, such as Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, such as Medicare Part D, or No Child Left Behind, or, when Bush went to war, he went to war with Congress voting for and authorizing the use of force. But think about how much with Trump is just dependent on Trump. It is all related to Trump. And so when Trump is gone, a lot of MAGA's revolution goes right with it.
Tara, I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer a similar question, and then we'll get to final thoughts. Tara, you said the GOP's problem is moral rot. David has said it's structural incentives. Which problem is actually harder to fix?
Well, I think that the moral rot part of this is more difficult to fix because it is a character issue, and part of that moral rot is the incentive structure for rewarding bad behavior. So I think that they are related. But if you change the incentive structure where you actually reward people for doing the right thing, not for doing the wrong thing, then perhaps then the indecency and the character issues become more workable, in that people realize, well, if I behave this way, I no longer will be rewarded. I actually recently gave a TED talk on this called "Stand Up or Stand By." Is morality is moral courage the revolution we need? Because we look at what's happening, and the lack of moral courage, the lack of civic responsibility and moral courage is partially why we find ourselves in this situation today, because people are not incentivized to do the right thing anymore. And we've seen this pattern of rewarding bad behavior in politics, I would argue, for a couple of decades now, but it's reached the point of critical mass where we have a convicted felon in the White House, where law and order doesn't matter, where cruelty and inhumanity is the point and people are proud of it, where you look at the behavior of elected officials thumbing their nose at the ethics rules, thumbing their nose at the rule of law, thumbing their nose at civil rights, thumbing their nose at constitutional rights, questioning them, and people like the Stephen Millers of the world claiming that the president of the United States has plenary power to basically do whatever the hell he wants, and the states be damned. The last time I checked, when David and I were Republicans, the 10th Amendment meant something. So, the Fourth Amendment meant something, illegal search and seizure. The First Amendment meant something. And right now, you see these things as though they're negotiable, and they didn't used to be. Nelson Rockefeller once said that for the way a party speaks and acts and should inspire a way the nation speaks and acts. You're starting to see that the way that people are behaving in public, the way they're going after immigrants in Home Depots or, in restaurants, this sniping at each other. We're seeing red versus blue. You're seeing the president of the United States sending National Guard troops from one state to another in violation of state sovereignty. What are we doing? We are so far from what we thought were just basic standards of decency. And you look at the people who are in power. Donald Trump was a TV personality, a reality show host who knew nothing about governing. Well, now look at who the government is filled with. And you talk about performative. You have a Fox News host as the Secretary of Defense, Pam Bondi, disrespecting senators in an oversight committee hearing, lobbing insults. Kash Patel as the FBI director, a podcaster, Dan Bongino in the FBI, Tulsi Gabbard as our DNI. I mean, the list goes on of people who are wholly unserious and unqualified, but they look good on TV. They know how to perform to get Donald Trump's attention. It's an audience of one. It doesn't matter what the policies are. So this is look at Kristi Noem, what they're doing, the absolute disgraceful behavior by our federal law enforcement agencies under her command, violating rights every day. For what? Taxpayer funded Hollywood style propaganda videos. It's just outrageous what we see. And I think a lot of this stems from the moral rot and the cowardice and just craven political desire for power has really gotten us to a place where the American people need to stand up and make a decision. Is this the future you want? Is this sustainable in a constitutional republic? or not, because we still do have the power as the people for right now. But we have to make a decision. Are you going to stand up or stand by as this continues to go on in our country?
Final thoughts, Tara.
Well, I think, as I just said, that the American people are at a precipice right now, and our democracy is under direct threat. And when we have one major party that seems to think that the Constitution is negotiable, we need to really make decisions here about what the priority is in this country. And it's important that if you want, as Abraham Lincoln said, a government that is of, for, and by the people, we need to take a very strong look at the positions and the behavior of the people in power and decide, is that the future you want to leave for your children? Do you want to be part of the generation that potentially lost democracy? And that is the question right now, I think, that every single one of us needs to ask ourselves when we're looking at, is it more important to be loyal to a party leader and more loyal to a party, or is it more important to put your country over that party loyalty?
All right, final thoughts.
Look, I'm a fan of what my former colleague at National Review, Jim Garrity, has said. He's long said this: reality gets a vote and reality always wins. And one of the realities, sadly, of populism is that populism tends to make people poorer. It tends to make people more miserable. It tends to make people more angry, which is one of the reasons why populist waves come and crucially go throughout American history. So the real question isn't, will this wave come and stay? It's, how much damage will it do before it goes? That's the real question. And so, I'm not somebody who looks at American history and has an overly rosy view, because I know the American experiment has been more contingent, perhaps, than we like to think, especially early on. There were secession conversations around the War of 1812. There was actual secession in 1861. In 1863, arguably the entire republic came within the possible losing of the Battle of Gettysburg, of failing and falling. Then you had the abandonment of Black Americans in 1877 with the Compromise of 1877 ending Reconstruction. You had Woodrow Wilson putting political prisoners in jail at scale during World War I. You've had numerous moments in American history where it just didn't feel as if this American experiment was going to survive, much less thrive. And I think we're in a moment where the American experiment is in a period of real backsliding. Our commitment to American ideals, and sadly, largely coming through my former party, the Republican Party, the commitment to America's founding ideals is sliding. It's very sad that it's occurring right on the eve of our 250th anniversary. But this will end. It will end. The real question is, what will replace it? How will it, these are the questions are, what will replace it and how will it end? How much damage will be done? So I think that there are two tasks right now that conservatives and their liberal friends who are wanting to have two healthy parties, there are two key tasks. One is hang on by our fingernails during the populist wave. In other words, maintain institutions, protect individuals and institutions who are carrying the standard for genuine conservatism and a genuine commitment to character. So keep and hold on by your fingernails as much as you can, as long as you can. And then you have to have a vision for rebuilding. So it's not just enough to hang around. You've got to have a concrete set of ideas and goals to rebuild. And that, I think, is really the next task of sort of the Never Trump movement, of the Democratic Party, of dissenting members of the Republican Party. What is next? How will we rebuild after this moment?
Hey, David, Tara, I could talk to both of you for hours. What a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much for taking part of that in this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Hello, everyone. I'm Hannah Doba. I am an anchor for News Nation. I will be moderating today's conversation, the split in the Democratic Party. I'm just going to go to our guests because we have a limited amount of time. Waleed Shahid, progressive strategist and former communications director for Justice Democrats, and Jim Kessler, co-founder and executive vice president for policy at The Third Way. It's great to have both of you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Waleed, I will start with you. The Democratic Party's base looks different than it did a decade ago. Younger, more diverse, more progressive. How is the party redefining that base? And is anyone feeling left out of this new vision for the Democrats and the future of the Dems?
Thanks for having me. I think there's a lot in this debate that Jim and I probably disagree on, but on this point, I imagine we probably agree, in which that the Democratic Party over the last 10, 20 years has left out many non-college educated voters, voters who may have been union members, voters who have working class jobs, service sector jobs, have increasingly fled from the party, voters of all racial backgrounds and makeup, voters of all ages. And we saw that come to, saw that trend most in the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Joe Biden was able to recover those voters in a major way. And then in 2024, we saw an even bigger drop off, particularly amongst immigrant voters, Latinos, and Asians. And I think a lot of that can go back to a feeling that the Democratic Party is adrift. They're not really fighting for you. Some of that is fair and some of that is unfair, given the information environment that we live in and the media that people consume. But largely, I feel like most voters feel like the Democratic Party is not fighting for the issues that people care about, which, as we saw in the New York City mayoral race, seem to be issues of affordability and cost of living. In 2024, what happened, I think, is that in large part, many voters, it was a referendum on Joe Biden himself as a person and his presidency. And so people felt that he was too old. People felt that the party leadership was hiding that he was too old. And then on some of the major issues like affordability, cost of living, foreign wars in Ukraine and in Gaza, that the president was not communicating about the issues that they cared about. And unfortunately, Kamala Harris had only a few, 107 days to run her campaign. It became a referendum on a party that was largely out of touch and more concerned with self-preservation than fighting for the little guy.
Tim, from your vantage point at Third Way, do you see the Democratic base expanding or narrowing? Is this party still the big tent that can win a purple America moving forward?
Right now, the answer is no. So I agree with a lot of what Waleed said. There's some places where I disagree. So where I agree is that educational divide. If you look at the 20 states that have the highest educational attainment in America, most college degrees per capita, Harris won 18 of 20 of those states. Democrats are plus 95 in the House there. And in the Senate, it's 34-4 Democrats, because one of those states is actually not a state, it's DC. Now the other 31 states with lower educational attainment, Harris won 2. Donald Trump won over 270 electoral college votes in those 31 states. We're minus 100 in the House. It's 13-49 in the Senate. Now, that's where Waleed and I agree. Where I disagree is some of the reason is just voters think the party's gone too far left. And in particular on a lot of social, cultural issues. So, I do believe that, yes, in some ways it was a referendum on Joe Biden and his age, but it was also on the referendum that Joe Biden, who ran as a moderate in 2020, governed as the most progressive president we ever had. I think that had something to do with his age as well. I think his staff kind of took over there. And on a lot of issues, the border, crime, transgender issues, a lot of the social issues, voters thought not only was Biden out of touch with where I am, the voter, but was concentrating on issues that seemed far away from what voters cared about. So I think this is a party that is in trouble, and its base is narrowing, not growing.
We touched on the party's base. I'm going to move on to competing narratives and brand identity. Jim, I'll start with you.
Yeah.
From AOC to Biden to governors like Gretchen Whitmer, Democrats are telling very different stories about what it means to be a Democrat. Which story is actually connecting with voters? There's obviously a messaging problem with Dems. I think we can all agree with that. And which one do you think is turning them off?
Right. So I just want to go to something that happened very, very recently. People celebrated either Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, whichever choice you prefer. But there were some very prominent Democrats on that day who posted on social media, these are elected congressional Democrats, who said, let's remember that this land that we're living in is stolen. And that, by all rights, we are the illegitimate heirs of that land. And if you're a party that believes that in any way that the United States of America is not a legitimate country, and that is a view, and it may not be the prevailing view among elected Democrats, but it is a view among elected Democrats who are very adept at new media, at social media, at getting their views out there. If that's the way you feel, that is painting the party in a way that makes it unelectable in most places. And I pick that as just one issue that's out there in which voters are saying, like, this really does not reflect where I am. And in my view, there are a whole series of issues where, Democrats talk about like that conversation you have at the kitchen table. And when we talk about those kitchen table issues, we imagine it as an economic discussion, paying your bills, your student loans, your energy, your utility bills, affording a vacation. But part of that kitchen table conversation that voters are having among themselves and their families is just a real discomfort with where Democrats are on the border, on defunding the police, on some of the social issues in which they feel like I'm either number 20 on a list of top 10 Democratic concerns, or in a place that just feels, beyond the norm. And that is where I think the big problem that Democrats are having. I know Waleed and I have differences on the economic outlook where Democrats should be economically. I believe most voters don't hear that argument on the economy because it's being overshadowed by these other cultural issues that take precedent, it seems, in voters' minds.
Talk about the economy in just a few moments. Waleed, I'm going to jump off from the story that Jim just shared. So, correct me if I'm wrong here, Jim. It seems progressives argue that moderates dilute the message. Moderates say the left alienates swing voters. So who's right and what's the proof here, Waleed?
Well, so this past election was the first election where many people in my family did not vote for the Democratic candidate. They either voted for Donald Trump or for third-party candidates. And, my dad is one of those people. My dad has voted Democrat in every election since he was eligible to and when he became a citizen. And, I asked him, I was trying to persuade him to vote for Kamala Harris. And he said, what has Joe Biden done for me in the last 4 years? And I think that question actually answers and kind of relates to a lot of what Jim is saying, which is that even the positive things that Joe Biden had done on the economy between in his term, or the things that Kamala Harris was in her platform, that voters are not hearing. My dad did not attend college. Voters are not hearing the economic policies and the economic arguments that Democrats are making. And so when that doesn't happen, a lot of these culture war issues do rise to the surface as the things that get attention in today's, social media algorithms and whatever. And so, there's part of what Jim is saying that I agree with. I think the other main part is that Democrats are not doing a good enough job communicating in a conflictual, attentional, exciting way about how they're going to lower costs for the average American. And then you have this age and gerontocracy issue where, in a state like New York State, there's been numerous polls that have come out that show that, someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is polling 10, 15, 20 points higher than Senator Chuck Schumer. And, Jim, I'm sure, when Jim was mentioning his comments about Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day, we know the wings of the party that he's describing, and yet voters voters in the city chose a progressive, young, new generation Democrat, Zoran Mamdani, to be the New York City's Democratic nominee, and are preferring AOC over the more moderate Chuck Schumer. And so I don't think these categories neatly line up on left versus center left, woke versus unwoke, but like who's fighting for you, who's resonant, who's capable of getting your attention. And right now, I think that in terms of, the Democratic Party leadership is incredibly unpopular amongst members of their own party. And so we're going to see people rising who are able to get the attention of the voters of the party and able to show that they're fighting for them and representing them. We have the No Kings rally coming up. We've had these anti-oligarchy tours. I saw today that AOC and Bernie are hosting a town hall about how Republicans are trying to eliminate healthcare and this shutdown. I think all of these things add up to Democrats attempting to center an argument about corruption and economic populism, while there's a lot of other Democrats, particularly older Democrats, who are unable to grab attention. And so then all this noise and culture war issues fill the vacuum in a ways that often benefits Republicans who are, it is clear that the country has changed on gender norms, sexuality, race. We have the largest prison population in the world. These are questions that, we have to address through policy and substance. But when you're not able to give an argument on it, then you just hear noise from the other side and from the kind of algorithms that dominate in TikTok and Instagram.
So intrigued by this topic. We have less than 10 minutes, so I will get into the economy. Let's talk money. Walid, I will start with you. Justice Democrats helped pioneer small dollar movements based on fundraising. We saw that with Zoran Mamdani. If the party's money and its messages aren't coming from the same place, can Democrats still speak with one voice?
I don't think Democrats do not speak with one voice until there's the primary contest for the presidential race, in which they choose the one voice we choose the one voice that we want to represent the party. And so in a two-party system, you're going to have competing voices. Someone in the Bronx versus someone in Nebraska are not going to feel exactly the same things. But, I was looking at some of the fundraising numbers, and some of the leading people who are fundraising are people like AOC and Bernie Sanders. They're raising, they're the only people that they're trailing are the Democratic Party's official entities like the DNC and the DSCC. And one thing that's unfortunate about money in politics is that in the 2024 primary cycle, the largest spenders in Democratic primaries were AIPAC, which is an extremely, pro-Israel right-wing cryptocurrency. So what those doing is parties, trying to be a disciplining force on the Democratic Party related to policy regarding the economy, Silicon Valley, big tech accountability, and then also foreign policy, in which makes it very hard for people like Zoran Mamdani to emerge across the country. In New York City, we have public financing. Many of those PACs did not, AIPAC did not get involved in the New York City Democratic primary race. And so both those factors enabled Zoran Mamdani to be able to raise the money he needed to compete. But, by and far, I think AIPAC had announced they wanted to spend 100 times what any progressive Democrat who opposed their views on the war in Gaza were able to do. And I think that's harmful for democracy. At the same time, very quickly, I'll just say that, I was looking at some statistics this morning about the average American household. Average income for a family is about $100,000 a year. When you factor in costs for housing, childcare, healthcare, cars, and groceries, that ends up being about $100,000 for each family. And so maybe they have about $2,000 left to spend on utilities, phones, clothes, medical emergencies, student loans. Families are really struggling right now with the cost of living, and they've been struggling for a while. And so I do think that we need a party that is very much focused on some of the things that Zoran campaigned on, with real solutions on how to address those, not just TikTok, but also just policy substance about how we plan to address people's actual pocketbooks.
Thank you for that, Walid. Jim, Third Way has the ear of major donors and institutional backers. Are these funding streams, whether they're establishment or grassroots, aligned, or are they increasingly working against each other?
I don't think they're aligned. I'm not worried that they're not aligned. So first, let me just say about money in politics. I don't think any of it's good. I don't think the large money in politics is good. I'm very concerned since Citizens United about what billionaires can do and how much they can donate. Since social media exploded, I don't love the low dollar donors either. The performative nature of what elected officials are doing, begging for money. I mean, Waleed, you probably get more solicitations than I do, but every single day, like just begging for money and some sort of performance to get my attention. I think all of it in its own way is harmful. As for the competing narratives, I'm also not worried about that either. When you lose, and especially if you lose to somebody like Donald Trump, there should be a free-for-all. There should be a little chaos. There should be arguments within the party. The Democratic Party has been arguing amongst itself really since the DLC was founded in the 1980s and, Bill Clinton emerged on the scene. I think that argument is good. And ultimately,
well, maybe 100 years before that too.
Yes, true. But sort of in modern day, in sort of that ideology, like you saw that come up. We're a party where roughly 40% of Democratic voters are self-identified progressives, about 50% are self-identified moderates, and 10% kind of fall into either socialist or conservative there. So our nature is to argue. Then we have this argument in a presidential primary, a leader emerges, and we all back that person. And that's going to happen this time. And in the midterms, it's going to feel like chaos. And that doesn't bother me right now. But I am concerned that, like, I do think if you're thinking about a national brand and trying to win in 2028, like if you're a candidate that says, we're on stolen land, or defund the police means defund the police, or there needs to be open borders, or, some version like overly into the socialist camp, you cannot win in this country. You may run, it may be possible that you win the nomination, but you cannot win in this country. And we saw Kamala, who I thought ran a pretty good race for the first 5 weeks, what she did when she was running in 2019 for president, and the questionnaires that she answered, and to try and get donors and appeal to the progressive base, it killed her. Like that they/them ad, it killed her. Also saying, I don't know what I'd do differently than Joe Biden. That was another self-inflicted wound 5 years later. But I just did the internet is forever. Like what you say moving forward can be a problem.
Closing round, we will talk about moving forward. If Democrats don't resolve these internal tensions, what does the party look like in the midterms and 2028? And Jim, I'll start with you this time. And I'll pose the same question to you after, Waleed.
I think there's a couple of models of candidates. And Waleed, you mentioned Mamdani, and that is certainly a model of a young, charismatic, social media proficient candidate who can excite a lot of people, who I believe can win in a place like New York City, but there's very few places that candidate can win elsewhere. And then I think there's a moderate candidate that's more like Abigail Spanberger, who hopefully will be the next governor of Virginia, who's also young, not as young as Mamdani, adept at social media, strong, moderate, but can excite voters. I believe that Democrats need to nominate somebody in 2028 who's more moderate than progressive, okay, on the issues, but has more of the flair for reaching people that a Mamdani has or a Painter has up in Maine. And, generationally is more of Waleed's generation than of my generation. Yeah, so I think that's the right mix for Democrats going forward presidentially.
Waleed.
I mean, there's going to be a lot of primary races in 2026 that will, basically suggest where the party is moving and where voters and donors and activists are all lining up. We saw now in Maine, you have an exciting populist candidate backed by Bernie Sanders, Graham Plattner, versus Chuck Schumer, and the party establishment recruited the governor of Maine to run also in that seat to take on Susan Collins. We'll see what happens with that race. You also have Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan versus two other Democratic candidates
McMorrow and Stevens, yeah.
Yeah, and so we'll see where voters line up on that. But those kinds of races are going to determine the kind of pulse of the party. I will say that, one thing that I find unfortunate is that in the lead up to the New York City mayoral race, the New York Times had said basically do not vote for Zoran Mamdani. And I think that there's a lot of movement within the more center left or moderate or conservative democratic forces to really quell the emergence of people like Zoran, people like AOC, people like Graham Plattner and Abdul El-Sayed, more of the progressive populist younger wing of the party. The organization that Jim represents, Third Way, also put out a memo saying, do not, please strongly consider not voting for Zoran Mamdani, that he would be terrible in the fight against Trumpism, that he would be terrible for New York City. And I think that this kind of way in which it's clear that voters in New York City rejected what Third Way and rejected what the New York Times, New York Times, the paper of record in the country, were recommending. And I do think that we should be a little bit more open to counterintuitive ways, both, in ways that maybe Jim would suggest that our wing of the party, the progressive wing of the party, maybe should be more open to people who are moderating on social issues or communicating about them in different ways, that some of the ways that these populist candidates are communicating about the economy or the political establishment or corruption, I think should be, we shouldn't be so alarmist about someone like Zoran Mamdani winning the Democratic primary. And I think that, hopefully he's going to inspire a lot more people to get involved. What is unfortunate is to get to the meat of your question, is that when leaders like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries do not endorse the Democratic nominee as leaders of the party, it does make a lot of young people feel that, when it comes around to moderates winning primaries, particularly in, swing seats or for the presidential seat, that why should young people who care about economic populism or maybe care about Israel-Palestine, why should they get behind a candidate who doesn't fully embody their views? And I think it would be, I hope that Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries endorse, but the fact that it's taken this long has already rubbed many of Zoran's supporters the wrong way.
The S word is definitely the problem there, the socialist word. So, I think that's, they're concerned about what it'll mean nationally, and I don't blame him. If he does become mayor, I hope he's a great mayor, because I love New York City.
Zoran, just to be clear, Zoran would be the third socialist mayor of New York City. So there is a history in the United States of David Dinkins was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and Mayor LaGuardia was also a member of the Socialist Party.
I'm old enough to know David Dinkins. He was a mainstream Democrat, David Dinkins.
And a member of the DSA.
Maybe, but he was a mainstream Democrat. He was your typical Democrat.
Listening to both of you for the last few minutes, this question keeps coming to me, and I will start with you, Jim, and I'll end with you, Walid. Are Democrats governing from strength or from fear of backlash? Because I'm hearing it from both sides.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I don't think you can govern through fear of backlash. If you do, you're in trouble. I do think that fear of backlash for Democrats comes from the left, who, to their credit, they're just far more organized. And, another memo that we put out was, shred the questionnaires. And if you look at all the questionnaires that the groups put out, they just put Democrats into these awful contortions about the policies that they want you to follow and to, check the box, put your name there. policies that people don't understand that put you far left in language that nobody would ever use. And then if you deviate in any sort of way, you get lambasted on social media or people show up at your events and protest. Hats off to the progressives for being able to do that. Moderates are not going to do that. Okay, we just aren't. That's a arrow that's not in our quiver. But what that backlash comes from is the left. Well, because of that backlash, I think we've alienated ourselves from a lot of voters. And I just want to give you one anecdote. I'm sorry to go on so long. I got a call during the Biden administration, and it was as inflation was heating up, and they said, "Do you know anything about supply chains?" And I said, "Well, you should talk to people at Walmart or Amazon or GM, because that's all they do." And this high-level official in the Biden administration said, "We're not allowed to." And I said, "I'm sorry, I can't help you. If you want to talk about supply chains, you've got to talk about somebody in the industry." Well, they were not allowed to because they were afraid of getting destroyed by the groups because, oh, you're talking to corporate America, you're bringing corporate America in. Well, instead we got inflation, and then we got Donald Trump. So there is fear of the backlash if you're a Democrat. It comes from the left. No one's afraid that some centrist organization like Third Way is going to criticize you. Believe me. Wish they were afraid.
Well, so one of the things that like Jim didn't mention in his remarks right there is that, historically there since basically the war in Iraq started, many Muslim Americans, South Asian Americans, Arab Americans have voted for the Democratic Party. And this past year in 2024 was the first time that you saw a major swing from that voting bloc in a swing state like Michigan and also in Georgia toward third parties in the Republican Party because of a group or a number of groups with questionnaires making sure that the Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, did not move from Joe Biden or AIPAC's position on sending unrestricted weapons aid to Benjamin Netanyahu. And so, there are groups on left, right, and center that make Democrats take positions that are not in touch with where the electorate is. But I do think that, the same goes for the many of the cryptocurrency PACs that are also forcing Democrats to not take a strong stand against regulation of that industry and fairness in that industry. And I do think that, what Jim had just mentioned about an official at the Biden administration saying that they couldn't talk to Walmart or Amazon, on the other side of that, the fact that the Democratic National Convention can't have one single Arab American on the convention stage is another example of the party being too afraid of its own shadow to take any risks anywhere, whether it's talking to people in corporate America or, a single Arab American in a moment where many Arab Americans wanted to feel included in the party at the convention. And so I do think that the party in all directions is operating largely from a place of fear, but the people who will emerge most in this kind of interregnum, in this intermediary liminal period, will be people who take risks, whether that's people from the left of the party or the center or the right of the party. I think voters are looking for direction right now, looking for ideas, looking for vision. And I think that, people who are taking risks, whether it's Gavin Newsom or AOC or Bernie Sanders or whoever it is, Graham Plattner, they are going to emerge as the leaders of the party and people who are, and, that's why I'm excited to see Chuck Schumer actually fighting on this healthcare and shutdown front, because I think his stature and the party's stature was diminished the last time that we had this fight. And so, people are looking in the ability of Donald Trump and the right to command attention. We need Democrats to be able to also put out ideas for how they think that we should fight authoritarianism and the affordability crisis.
Please complete this sentence in 10 words or less if you can.
Okay.
The Democratic Party will win nationally again if.
if they center on lowering the cost of living for working class and middle class Americans.
Jim, same question. Democratic Party will nationally win again
If they seem normal and fight for my economic interests.
they seem normal. What does that mean?
Not taking positions that seem so far out of the mainstream.
Jim, do you think Zoran Mamdani is normal or AOC is normal?
Let me speak more on AOC than Zoran because I don't follow the mayor's race as closely as I would follow. I think AOC is incredibly gifted politician. I think she has taken positions that are far outside the mainstream and don't seem like that's normal. So I'm not saying
this is where I would push back is like, I think it's not normal for Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries to think we should provide unrestricted weapons aid to countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia. So like the definition of normal feels pretty like narrow in my view of what you're presenting.
So fair enough. And I'm not going to get into a Gaza-Israel debate with you, but fair enough on that. But what I would say is on the issues that most people cared about that were close to home, and I would say the border, crime, inflation, some version of wokeism, and Biden's age on those 5 issues, Democrats did not seem normal. Okay. We did not seem normal on the border, like millions of people went over the border and we were, and there were enough, and I would put AOC in that category that were supporting something that you could be easily categorized as open borders. I think defund the police was a huge, huge error for Democrats. On inflation, I do think Biden overspent and mishandled the economy somewhat, and the whole idea that it was transitory, I think, is a complete lack of understanding of the private sector. I think on wokeism, and we talked about this somewhat throughout, like Democrats do seem like the censor party, the cancel culture party. And then on Biden's age, we were denying what everyone could see in front of them. And I would say all wings of the party were equally guilty on that. On some of the issues that you just talked about, like Gaza and Israel, like those are really, really heated issues and important issues, but for a smaller segment of the population. And it does seem like the Democratic Party is arguing a lot over issues that are of huge importance to smaller slices of the population. And that a lot of voters were looking out and said like, okay, why aren't you talking about, my immediate concern? And Waleed, when you were saying like the average household, about 100,000 in household income, my income is higher than that, significantly higher. Inflation is something I noticed, but it is not an quote unquote existential crisis. Well, Democrats talk about existential crises like democracy and climate and other issues that are way up in the stratosphere. People's electricity bills is an existential crisis. The price of eggs were, and we weren't talking about those things, and we didn't have an answer on those things. And if there's crime in your neighborhood, that's an existential crisis. So I just felt normal is really trying to focus on the issues that voters tell us are their top concerns, not what we tell them should be their top concerns. I think Zoran's done a good job of that. I think that's one of the reasons why he's emerged to become, that alternative, and let's face it, you couldn't have a better foil than Andrew Cuomo if you want to be different and show that it's time for, to turn the page, right?
I'm pretty sure we're out of time, but I haven't, yes. Okay. Final thoughts. And Waleed, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the point I was trying to make is that like there are abnormal people in all wings of American politics. And so Andrew Cuomo, Eric Adams are people who don't seem normal right now compared to someone like Zoran Mamdani. And so I want to pick on a part of agreement that I have with Jim, which is that I think it would be beneficial for the Democratic Party and for the country for Democrats to argue with each other about what are the plans that we have to lower healthcare costs, lower housing costs, lower higher education costs, childcare costs for the average American. And if we can create conflict around these issues, that will drive attention around those issues in a way that I think will benefit the party as a whole, to get sharper about what policies, what messages resonate with the country, and with, people who are struggling with the cost of living right now, as I mentioned about, how most Americans don't have that much disposable income to spend on things like vacation or even planning for the future. And yeah, I think a major difference between Jim and I is that when you're not able, or maybe this is a similarity, but when you are not able to own and prioritize the economic argument and the cost of living argument, the affordability argument, then all this other stuff around, around the culture war issues does tend to dominate. But I would say that a big issue was like the party being asleep at the wheel on issues like immigration and crime and transgender issues, and not really taking strong stands or painting a vision of those things, rather than, and then having the Republican Party have a really strong vision on those things. And I think it would behoove the party and its leaders to have articulate views that resonate with the majority of the people about what you want to do about balancing public safety with justice, what you want to do about the fact that the country has changed on gender and how we treat women and how we treat people who are transgender. We do have to figure out what to do about the fact that hundreds of thousands of people came across the border, were given work permits in a way that felt unfair to a lot of people, and how to fix the asylum process. When you have a party that's unable to communicate or unable to be trusted on those issues, then it's hard, even if you take Republican light or conservative views on that issue, it's hard to bleed through. I mean, most swing state Democrats, most swing seat Democrats who ran in 2024, like Sherrod Brown and Jon Tester, ran on messages about how they supported views against Joe Biden and views against Kamala Harris on issues like policing and crime and immigration. And it wasn't enough to get over the finish line. And so I think we do need a stronger vision about those issues that aren't just, I agree with Republicans.
Jim, final thoughts.
So first of all, I noted earlier that the nature of Democrats is to argue. That's what our coalition is, and that's what this was, and it's healthy and it's a good thing. And it's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic that we can nominate somebody in 2028 that can return a Democrat to the White House. I think these arguments are good, and it's very important. One thing that I would add is, and it's part of the nature of our coalition, which has become much more college educated and wealthy, along with minorities of all income levels. When you're wealthy, a lot of times your top concerns are other people's concerns, not your own. Transgender people, women's right to choose, democracy, the climate, peace somewhere else outside of the United States. And they're all important things. If you look at much of the country, particularly the interior of the country, if you look at the 32 states that do not touch either coast, Harris won only 6 of those 32 states, okay? One of them was Vermont, and another wasn't a state, it was DC. That's the worst performance of any Democrat since Mike Dukakis. In that interior part of the country, education levels are lower, household income levels are lower, and the concerns of voters there are much more not about the future, but about today, my today problems. And Democrats always say elections are about the future, about the future, about the future. Trump said, no, elections about today. Your crime, the border, your costs of living. We have to get the tomorrow balance, which is our highly educated, upper middle class, professional voters who care about all sorts of things outside of their own home, with the I have problems today that I need to solve and goals that I don't feel that I can achieve. And we need to get that balance right and focus more on people who have today problems, not somebody else's problems. That's where I think a big shift Democrats have to make.
All right, Jim Kessler, Waleed Shahid, thank you so much. It was such a brilliant conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope our listeners and viewers do too. I'm Hannah Doba. Thank you so much for sticking around.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Very excited to have this conversation. Gen Z is often cast as a monolithic liberal bloc. I remember hearing refrains about how Gen Z would save the Democrats as part of a permanent liberal majority for many years. But as we saw last year, the reality is far more complicated. They've been shaped by very different experiences of the pandemic, economic instability, and digital life. So it turns out Gen Z might end up being a very fragmented generation. But what are those divisions? What are those differences? We have a great pair of panelists here to help talk about this and discuss this. I have Rachel Genfaza, who's the founder of the Up and Up, a qualitative research, media, and strategy firm focused on Gen Z. She's a member of Gen Z herself and does extensive writing and analysis on young people in America. And Victor Shi is a writer, speaker, organizer, activist, and podcast co-host. He served as the youngest elected delegate for Joe Biden's 2020 campaign. He's been described by some outlets as, quote, the most energetic Gen Zer on the platform called X, and is also a frequent analyst and commentator on Gen Z youth. Thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you, Christian. Great to be here.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, thank you.
So, Rachel, I'll start with you. We're talking about the split in Gen Z, and I have to say you were probably the first commentator, writer, etc., that I saw try to describe a divide within Gen Z. I remember the first Venn diagram online. I think I saw it on Instagram first, and then it wandered its way around the internet. And so I want to ask you, can you tell us, is the dividing line of Gen Z, if there is one established by the pandemic, one established by social media and cell phones, one about memories of presidents like Obama versus Trump? Is it something else?
So first of all, thank you so much. And thank you to the 92nd Street Y for having us. When I started to think about the divide between what I call the two Gen Zs, it was really in the lead up and right after the 2024 election. And the first time that I wrote about this split within Gen Z was in November 2024, just weeks after the election. And I saw a stark divide between younger Gen Zers and older Gen Zers politics, with the younger cohort, which I call Gen Z 2.0, leaning to the right. And part of this, you asked, is there one dividing line that really marks the two Gen Zs? And I think it's a mix of both how old a young person was at the time of the start of the pandemic. So I've used the cutoff of whether or not they were still in high school during the start of the pandemic, because I think that gives us key clues about how they felt about institutions and authority based on whether they were still in their K through 12 education at the time or not. And also that same divide leads to their relationship to technology. So the younger cohort of Gen Z grew up with TikTok as something that was just a mainstay in their life. Whereas for me, when I was in high school and for basically all of college, TikTok wasn't a thing, it didn't exist. And so the way that young people consume and create content today is just vastly different than it was because of the advent of TikTok and the way that it really has changed social media across the board with these bite-sized pieces of content that need to grab your attention within the first millisecond. And that has changed younger Gen Z's attention span, really all of our attention spans, for the way that this has been adopted across social media platforms and even in mainstream news and television and entertainment as well. So those are sort of the two big factors that I see as the dividing lines within Gen Z.
Victor, is that something that you're seeing also? Is that something that you observed, last year during the presidential campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much to the 92nd Street Y for having us again. And we've all benefited so much from Rachel's reporting and the amazing work that she's done to cover young voters and Generation Z. But it's definitely something that we noticed on the presidential campaign last year. I had the honor of working, started off with then candidate Biden, and then of course the switch happened to Vice President Harris. But we noticed a lot that a lot of the younger generations of Gen Z, or like sort of the after the split, what we found is that the sort of difference is like whether or not they had information or whether or not they paid attention. And if young voters didn't really pay attention, we found that they really didn't care about politics. They didn't really get the messages that we were hoping that they would get. And I think that that sort of aspect of them being on social media and really, I think just whether or not they're paying attention, I think that's a big part of sort of this younger cohort of Gen Z, and something that we've been struggling with as a party to reach them. And so that's part of the challenge post-election, is like, how do we reach that generation that doesn't really care about politics, that doesn't really follow the news? The information that they receive might not be political. And so how do we reach that part of Generation Z? And I think that's a big challenge for a lot of people in the party right now.
Yeah, I've always wondered whether there was a similarity between the divide of like active and passive news consumers and higher trust versus lower trust Americans, whether there's an overlap there and how much of that is describes Gen Z. I'm wondering, Rachel, if anything in the over the last few months, as President Trump has, been in office, if there's anything about how Gen Z's reacted or maybe hasn't reacted that might make you want to update the original thesis, or how maybe your thesis evolves on how that divide looks like now.
It's evolving every day. I think the number one thing that I'm thinking about when it comes to young Americans as voters is they are most focused on what is going on in their day-to-day life. So when we hear from Victor saying, they might are more passive in their consumption of information, they're paying attention to what's affecting them in their day-to-day life, and that's what's top of mind, and that's what will motivate their vote. So when it comes to President Trump, I think part of the top issue for young people in the 2024 election was the economy. And today, the top issue for young people is still the economy. And when I say the economy, it's not macro level stock market. It's the cost of living, the cost of rent, the cost of education, and the things that are affecting people every single day. So I think that there's a different relationship that older Gen Zers and younger Gen Zers have and will have as they continue to grow to exactly that when it comes to the cost of living, when it comes to their ability to afford rent, when we're looking at the job market and entry-level jobs that will or will not be available to new graduates or people looking for work with the rise of AI, and also young people's relationship to AI. So I have done some follow-up sort of distinctions within the Gen Z 1.0 and 2.0 framework. And some of the key frames and themes that I'm most interested in continuing to probe is the relationship that Gen Z 1.0 and 2.0 has to AI, the relationship that Gen Z 1.0 and 2.0 has to the American dream, and the relationship that Gen Z 1.0 and 2.0 has to the value of a traditional 4-year college education, because I think that that is changing as well, especially as AI takes many entry-level jobs and young people are left wondering, is it really worth it to go get this 4-year degree that I spend a ridiculous amount of money on just to be able to not get the job that I was studying for in the first place? So those are the frames that I'm thinking about as we look towards 2026 and 2028, but also just as we think about Gen Z, not just as voters, but as consumers, as employees, as audiences, as people, and as citizens.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I do feel like I saw some follow-up to your Politico magazine piece, I think it was, that tried to make the case that AI is the big dividing line and that maybe there are 3 Gen Zs, it turns out, 1.0, 2.0, and then the Gen Z youngest demographic that straddles the line between Gen Alpha also that is growing up with AI. That seems completely scary to me.
Totally. And the cutoff for Gen Alpha hasn't officially been announced yet. There's not a real consensus on that. And I think this is a large part of why.
Could I really quickly share? The rise of AI is such a big issue, obviously. But I was the class of 2024 for college, and one of the things I really noticed, I feel like we were the last class that sort of didn't have the proliferation of AI. Sort of happened at the end of our college experience. But I've been talking. I was an English major at UCLA, and one of the things I've been talking with a lot of English professors about, and their sort of experience in the classroom is like post class 2024. There's just been this proliferation of AI across the classrooms. And I think it's something that like no one quite knows the answer to in terms of how do you solve it. And a lot of people are thinking about that, but there is this increased and skyrocketed use of artificial intelligence across different platforms in the workplace. And it's just like everywhere now. And so like, how do we adapt to that? I think is one of the biggest questions facing this younger generation too.
Are you either of you hearing conversations from party leaders, party strategists, from candidates, from emerging candidates or aspiring candidates about how to handle that question, about how they are thinking about handling it, whether it's in terms of like the literal practical part of running a campaign or reaching voters versus policy or restrictions or limitations or regulation?
I've been thinking a lot about this primarily because I'm not hearing politicians talk about it in the way that I think that they should be. If we know, as Victor said, that Gen Z is using AI every single day, which they are, there needs to be some sort of conversation about what that looks like, because there's data from Gallup and the Walton Family Foundation showing that even though Gen Z is using AI every day, it makes them really anxious. And I've done a lot of research and writing about this over the past many months after, I've held listening sessions in person solely talking about AI and the way it's used in education and also concerns for the future with work in AI. And there's a assumption that's made that just because Gen Z is a digitally native generation and the first generation to grow up with ChatGPT, that they know how to use it and that they're eager to do so. But in reality, that's not the case. And so they're really looking to adults to help shepherd them through this technological revolution. And I think it would be really smart for any candidate trying to reach Gen Z in 2026, 2028, and long after that, to, first of all, understand the way that AI is being used. And it's not just for cheating at all. That's a massive misconception I wrote about for the Washington Post. But beyond that, they need to understand this tension that exists within this generation who is being told that if they don't use it, they're going to fall behind and the jobs are going to disappear. But they also aren't being taught how they're supposed to use it effectively or productively. And I think in large part, that's because no one really knows and it's changing so quickly. I spoke with a school principal in California who shared that if they were to create protocol and release it for the school with guidelines of how to use it, it would be outdated the moment that they created it. So I totally hear that. And this is not an easy question to find solutions or answers to, but I do think it would be smart for politicians to understand that this is a core issue for young people. And just generally, I think a lot of times we consider, when we look at politics, there are like core issues that we think young people care about, and then politicians message on those issues. But as Victor was saying, if we learned anything from 2024, it's that for young people, politics is so cultural. These are so interwoven. And that's why at the Up and Up, I've evolved beyond just focusing on young voters to young people across all sectors of our society, because for them, it's so interwoven. And this is one of the biggest examples of that, because their relationship to AI is related to economic concerns, workforce concerns, interpersonal concerns. It's all connected.
Victor, do you seem to be hearing anything similar, or what conversations can you share that maybe you've had with some folks working within party structures about how to address AI or how to address young people's anxieties over it?
Yeah, one of the things that concerns me the most about sort of our current political sort of atmosphere and the people who are in government is that, if you've ever watched one of those hearings about artificial intelligence, you really have very few senators or elected officials in Congress who understand what the issue is. And it's, I think, both the candidates or the elected officials, but also the staff level, who I think just need more education about what this is. And I think that's always been a tale as old as time, where government is slower to regulate to the technology that's emerging or that's happening right now. And I feel like one of the things that I've been paying a lot of attention to are these sort of younger people within the Democratic Party, or just politics in general, who are thinking a lot about this issue. So I'm thinking of people like Representative Jake Auchincloss in Massachusetts has done a lot of work around social media companies, artificial intelligence, the attention economy. People like Lena Khan, who was a former FTC chair, has talked a lot about this as well. But we have these sort of younger people in the party who I think can sort of understand this issue a little bit better than the folks who are a little bit older. And those are the people who I feel like are driving a lot of the conversation about where this is going. But even then, it's very few and far between. But like Rachel said, I think it's smart for candidates and elected officials to pay attention to this issue. I think it's smart for them to focus on this issue because it's something that's everywhere, and people really have to understand what's going on and how to sort of adapt policy to meet the sort of moment that we're in. But it's definitely, I think, a big challenge that is just, government's sort of slow to adapt to it and slow to meet the sort of, or create policy to meet the moment.
Yeah, I do feel like it feels almost like we're approaching the edge of a cliff of some kind, or there is some kind of abyss or some kind of fog that is in front of us, that we know there's something there, but we're not just there yet, and we're kind of navigating our way toward it. But I feel like we could keep talking about AI for a really long time. There are some other issues that I wanted us to chat about. So it feels like, moving to Gen Zers today, there's a lot of talk about just how real or how large what the measure we can use is to describe the seemingly cultural / religious shift of many aspects, many parts of the Gen Z demographic. I know that last year there was talk about Gen Zers finding religion, about Gen Zers becoming more culturally conservative potentially. That aside from frustrations over the economy, there was a dissonance between what some parts of the Gen Z demographic believed about cultural and social issues and what maybe Democrats or the establishment / the status quo talked about. And so I posed that question to both of you. Does it seem like there was or is an actual tangible cultural, political, conservative shift happening among young people? Or was it more of a manifestation of, dissatisfaction, wanting to be countercultural in a way, rebelling against what the predominant maybe orthodoxy was on those various issues? Maybe we can start with Rachel.
This is a great question. I think there's definitely been a cultural shift. I wouldn't necessarily label it as conservative. I think there was a shift towards Trump, but many of the young people I've spoken to over the course of the past many months and years would say that even if they voted for Trump, they don't consider themselves to be conservative. They maybe consider themselves to be a part of the MAGA movement, but they're not ruby red Republicans. And on the same side, I know plenty of young people who voted for Vice President Kamala Harris who do not consider themselves a Democrat. And so there's been a shift away, a defection from both parties. Meanwhile, there also has been a rise in religion and other sort of cultural identities. And I think one of the things that I've noticed most recently, and that's been really compelling in my conversations over the past few months, mostly over the summer, is that I'm hearing from young people a strong appreciation for religion and for spirituality that doesn't necessarily have to do with the actual teachings of the religion or the church, but more so is just about, or maybe other religions, but I have heard this mostly when it comes to Christianity, but it's about the identity that's formed by leaning into religion. And it's about the relationships in the community and having that third place. And so I think it has far less to do with the ideology than it does the ability to find something where you can identify with and create community around. And the other thing I'll say about this is that I think there's a big misconception in that just when a young person says that they've become more religious, that automatically means that they're more conservative. That's far from the truth in my conversations. I've heard from plenty of super liberal young people and young women in particular who consider themselves to be very religious, and they also consider themselves to be very liberal.
That's really interesting. I've been wondering a lot about that, whether as we see more of an organizing around certain conservative, politically coded religious identity, whether we would see a similar rise among progressive/liberal coded religious identity too. And when you talk about a third place, right, that's like not home or work, that's another place of community, right?
Yeah, because this is the loneliest generation. And so they're looking for in-person areas to come together. And that's one perfect example of that.
Victor, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, and I'd be actually really curious to see if if Rachel's reporting and sort of analysis confirms sort of my theory of sort of where young people are in terms of like their hunger for politics, which is, I mean, one of the things that we saw a lot during the 2024 presidential campaign was that young people sort of are hesitant to attach themselves to labels, but they're very values driven. And one of the things that we sort of were looking on very early in the campaign is there was this Harvard poll that was released that basically showed that young people sort of their values aligned a lot with the Democratic Party. Like they cared about the climate change. They cared about, gun safety in schools. They cared about reproductive rights. They cared about the economy. But a lot of the things that they cared about the Democratic Party, the image and the brand was just awful. And so they sort of rejected being a part of the Democratic Party or associating themselves with the party. But I think for a lot of candidates running right now, they realize that they really have to talk about the issues that young people care about. So they have to talk about the values, they have to talk about the issues, they have to talk about what actually speaks to young people. And that's a more effective way of reaching them than just, a party label or, a party identification. And so I don't know, Rachel, is that still true, or what is your sort of reporting confirm? Because I feel like that's a lot of the conversations that I've been having, is that it's just like speak to the issues, speak to the values, and then it's much easier to sort of get their attention, or at least sort of engage them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the value orientation is spot on. And I think the reality is that young people, Gen Z across the board, we're the most diverse generation in American history. And so I think some of these sort of established truths have been kind of taken for granted in a way where many young people feel like the box has already been checked on equality in many forms because they go to school with, they live with, they see people who look different, come from different backgrounds, speak different languages than them, have different sexual identities and gender orientation, etc. So I know in many of my conversations with young Trump voters, they said, of course I'm pro-LGBTQ rights. Of course I'm pro-choice, but that didn't mean I wasn't going to vote for Trump because he said he's going to make the economy better. And that's what I'm focused on here. And also there were states like Arizona where you could both vote to pass a constitutional amendment protecting abortion in your state and also vote for Trump. And so they kind of felt like they were able to do both of those things. So I think this really is about culture and values, Victor, as you said. And I think Gen Z, and I was, writing about this and saying this from the rooftops in 2022 about how it was issues that matter. And this is an issue-driven generation, but I think that the prioritization of which issue comes first has just been a little bit rewired, where because of post-COVID inflation, skyrocketing costs of living and higher education, and just how hard it feels to be able to afford day-to-day life, that's become the top issue. And yet, I think that Democrats often were still leaning into climate change, abortion, LGBTQ rights, reproductive healthcare access, all of that. And even if that was something that this generation cared about and a voter cared about, they felt like, they needed to be able to get by on the day-to-day basis in order to even have the ability to care about those issues. And beyond that, I think many of these issues are intersectional. And so a lot of them feel economic as well.
That's really interesting. There are like a million threads I want to pick up from there. So I'm trying to figure out where to start. I think one thing that's interesting to me is the idea of some things being taken for granted or being taken as just a state of nature, a state of fact. I remember Rachel talking to you a little bit about, so after the Charlie Kirk assassination, a lot of talk about free speech, about conversations that young people want to have. People don't want to be pushed into corners or into boxes. And even if they agree or disagree with something, those young people want to have those conversations and want to have that debate. And I'm wondering how much that aspect of free speech, of campus discussion, defines the way that young people right now, or maybe the different parts of Gen Z, are thinking about politics, are thinking about their own identities and forming their identities. I remember when I was in college, we didn't really have that much, inter or cross party or cross ideological debates per se. I still remember it was like the peak of pro-campus protests against specific speakers. I don't know if that's the case now.
Freedom of speech is really up there with the economy as a top issue that young people are caring about. And I think it speaks to the larger cultural moment that we're in a sort of post-cancel culture. I don't know if we can call it post, but reckoning with cancel culture environment where Gen Z has, grown up in this era of divisive politics. And then the pandemic where people were, there's a track record of everything that you've ever said, and you can very quickly be accused online for having said something, and there can be a mass movement in response to whatever it is that you've said. And I think that Gen Z really doesn't like that, to be blunt about that. Like, there's not really a better way to say it. They hate it. And on both sides, I hear this from the most conservative and the most liberal people. And there's also a frustration that everything appears so black and white with very little room for nuance in the middle, and a frustration that, especially when you have the conversation about college campuses, I've heard from plenty of college students that they get frustrated when school administrators kind of just shut down conversations or say you're not allowed to have this discussion or debate, or cancel the speaker or whatever it is, because they feel that they're old enough, mature enough, and savvy enough to have the nuanced conversation, and they're really craving that. And so I think in many ways, there's been so much conversation about Charlie Kirk and the way in which he went about the campus debates that he was holding. But after he was killed, I heard from people, again, on the left and the right, just devastated that someone who was in favor of having these conversations, even if he was saying things that they vehemently disagreed with, was killed for basically doing so. And so, and then the response to that as well was really shocking to many people. And so I think when you're looking at this generation, I think there is a massive appetite for that space to come together and have this dialogue, and not in a cheesy kumbaya, let's all hold hands and be best friends and agree on everything, but in fact, let's talk about where we disagree, and it's okay to disagree. And we haven't had many positive examples from elected officials in our lifetime of the ability to do that. And that is really a turnoff. I think also when you look at young people's disaffection from the parties, it's like they don't see good leadership or good ability to have the dialogue that they're very hungry for.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like this connects to a bigger point about authenticity and about just seeming to be genuine and a real person that's not just bound by party line talk or by what an establishment figure might be telling you to do. I feel like there's a connection there on this issue.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with Rachel in the sense that we have to model what that looks like. And I think a lot of politicians just haven't really shown up on college campuses. They haven't modeled what that dialogue can look like. And really, I think Charlie Kirk was one of the only people, or maybe the only person, who did that on college campuses and would show up, do these in-person debates and conversations. And, and the people who I talk to, I think there is that real craving. And we're starting to see that across sort of different personalities. I mean, Alex Cooper, who's a big podcast host, bringing her show on the road. There's a lot of different podcasts and media figures who are starting to bring their shows to college campuses or to young people directly, because I think, like Rachel said, there is this hunger from young people to be in community, to be in conversation. And I think that the more that elected officials and people in politics can do that and really model what that looks like and show up on college campuses, have that conversation, young people are hungry for that.
That's so interesting. I was going to pick up from that a little bit of like a forward-looking question. Some of the people that we've talked about, Charlie Kirk, Alex Cooper, we can definitely categorize on the right side of the spectrum, ideologically, politically, versus the left. And I'm wondering, we've talked a little bit about issues and values. We've talked a little bit about movements in the past. I'm thinking of like the first Trump administration with the rise of the gun control, gun reform, safety movements, of climate, the Democratic Party rallying around reproductive freedom and abortion rights. And I'm wondering, now that we're in an era where it seems like a lot of whatever the progress was that was made by some of those groups, as they view it, may be hitting a wall, or as the Trump administration seems to roll back some of those efforts from progressive or liberal movements, that there may be a sense of disillusionment among some of those folks on that side of the spectrum, while at the same time there's an energizing that seems to be happening on the right among conservative youth potentially. And so I'm wondering if there's what is to be done about reigniting some of these issue-based movements, if issue-based movements are no longer or maybe seem like they haven't been as successful. What is the way for Democrats, for example, to rally young people again, to get them excited about some movement or maybe it's not around a candidate?
I can start with this one. I think we just need better leaders. I mean, we see the perfect example in New York, Zoran Mamdani, who I think is running a very energetic campaign. And, there's a lot of debate about his policies, but at least he is sort of reigniting sort of this energetic campaign that is engaging people across the generational spectrum, and so many young people turning out to vote for him in the primary, and I think are really energized by the vision that he's offering. But like I said before, I think we just need candidates who are, one, can really speak to the issues that young people care about, the values that young people care about. But we also need to sort of get away from the traditional way that we've been doing things as a party. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of Democrats are thinking about as we head into the midterm elections, is what are the type of candidates that we need to run who can offer that sort of fresh and new sort of vision that we haven't seen from our party before. And I think there's a strong bench, there's a deep bench across the country. And I really much look forward to seeing sort of who else emerges. But I think that's part of the biggest way that we can engage young people and really show them that we're thinking seriously about what we got wrong in 2024, and also sort of what this new version of the Democratic Party looks like. What do we believe in? What do we care about? And what our party can offer young people.
Yeah, Rachel, do you see that? Do you see any candidates or any younger up and coming political figures or emerging icons, either on the left or the right so far?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think just to take one step back and respond to something that Victor said too, and also, you mentioned sort of like the Charlie Kirks and Alex Coopers of the world. I think like both of them have tapped into culture. And Alex Cooper isn't traditionally political. Like, she's done a few episodes. She did an episode with Kamala Harris. She did an episode on abortion and reproductive healthcare access before the 2022 midterms. But she, she's a cultural icon. And I think that we've seen this conversation about new media and about politicians needing to engage with culture. And some of that has started to take fold. We've seen examples of elected officials creating their own podcasts. Maybe Gavin Newsom is a great example of that. Or we've seen members of Congress like Representative Sarah Jacobs really taking us behind the scenes through her fertility treatment and having that authenticity, and really just having elected officials adopt some of the practices that some of these media creators and content creators use, because that's how young people are used to consuming information. And sort of going back to Victor's earliest point about the way that Gen Z 2.0 consumes information as, just constant scrollers, I think they're used to that type of authenticity, that type of unfiltered, just saying it like it is. And so I think the biggest thing moving forward is young people are just looking for politicians to just be real. And that's really, it's not that much more complicated than that. And say it like it is, even if it's going to piss people off. I mean, if you look at Trump, he says everything, and it does offend a lot of people. And yet people appreciate that about him. So, there are examples of politicians and elected officials who are doing some of this on both the left and the right. I think also, people who are willing to traverse the media ecosystem and go anywhere and everywhere. And the reality is there's not one podcast that every single Gen Zer listens to, or one content creator who they follow. This is a very fragmented media ecosystem. And so there are various tracks that different people and niche shows and all of these different types of content creators that any politician could interact with. And so I've written a bit about this, but my biggest piece of advice to any candidate would be to find the lane that just works best for you and your personality. So if you're a candidate or an elected official who like really loves makeup and beauty, do a collab with a Get Ready With Me video with a makeup do a version of that. And Representative Jacobs has been doing that for sure. If you love to cook, go on a cooking show. If you love to fish, go on a fishing podcast. Like, there are so many different options and ways to go about this. I mean, there's obviously the Joe Rogans of the world and the Flagrant Show with Andrew Schultz, and we know people like Pete Buttigieg and James Tallarico have gone on those, but there's not a formula. It's really just about staying true to yourself.
Yeah. And thank you for correcting me on Alex Cooper. I've mixed up my podcasters.
There's so many of them. It's hard to keep track.
So many.
I was going to say, like, if you like running, go on a running podcast. If you like weightlifting, do that. But then the question is how to make sure it's not forced. I feel like maybe some candidates or some politicians have learned the wrong lesson from last year and are trying to do everything that they can and go on all these shows, even when it seems inauthentic, or maybe it's not inauthentic, but they're just not cut out for it. Like, my mind goes to like Rahm Emanuel going on the I've Had It podcast earlier this year. And I don't know that was the smartest decision to make. But we are running out of time. I have so many more questions that I want to ask, but I guess kind of a closing one is, what is the biggest misconception about Gen Z, how split it is, how divided it is, or how diverse it is, that you hear the most and that you want to correct the record on, that you think would make anyone watching this, listening to us, get a better sense of what is happening among this youngest cohort of our society? Maybe I'll start with Victor.
I think for me, it's that, don't assume that young people are all like the same, or that, that we're all just like, we care the same about certain issues. Like, really take the time to listen to young people and understand what they're thinking about. I think, like Rachel said, we are the most diverse generation, both racially, but also socioeconomically. And it's a very rapidly changing generation in terms of sort of our demographics. And I think that if more people sort of on the older side, candidates running for office, elected officials, can just take the time and listen to young people and really understand their concerns, I think we would be far better off for it. I think there's this assumption among a lot of sort of candidates and politicians who I talk to and work for who just assume that young people are all the same, and that's just not the case. And I think that it comes from this lack of urge to listen and really understand young people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Victor. And I always say, this generation is not a monolith. I think the biggest misconception or misunderstanding that I'm seeing is that just because a young person voted one way once means that they're going to vote that way again. This is a very malleable generation, and with the speed of our technology and how fast everything changes in our day-to-day lives, whether it be, AI or the ability to literally get food delivered or call a car in like 5 seconds. We're really used to instant gratification. And so if the policies that we perhaps thought we were voting for, that young people think that they're voting for, are not immediately put in place, I think there's frustration that grows, and whether or not that's justified or merited, is up for debate. But and politics is a slow process, and I think this generation doesn't necessarily always understand that, because it's just so not aligned with the speed of everything else in our lives. And so I think I would just caution everyone who is concerned about young voters or trying to engage young voters or younger consumers or younger audiences, really any young people at all, is just that they're willing to change their mind. And I don't think that should be taken for granted.
Thank you so much, you two. Where can we follow up or follow your work or your writings or your analysis?
Well, thank you so much, Christian. And thank you again to the 92nd Street Y for doing this. And Christian, I always love our conversations. Some of my favorite, phone calls have been when we've been discussing all these various topics. You can find my work at the Up and Up, my newsletter. It's on Substack, theupandup.us or upandupstrategies.com. I work with anyone who's trying to better understand Gen Z. So please reach out. It would be great to hear from you.
Yes, please follow Rachel's work. It is so important, and she does such an amazing job. Christian alluded to this at the top of the program, but I guess I'm somewhat active on X. I try not to be active on Twitter anymore, but I'm at Victor Shi 2020 on pretty much every platform, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for your time. And thank you to the 92nd Street Y.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to a discussion of a really important book and an important idea. that goes to the heart of a lot of what's happening in American politics right now. I'm really honored to be here with Suzanne and Trevor. I'm E.J. Dionne. I'm a professor at the McCourt School at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institutions. Suzanne Mettler is a very distinguished professor at Cornell University, the author of many books. One of my favorites is about the GI Bill, which we won't talk about today, but I recommend it to you highly. Maybe we will. And Trevor Brown, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University and is headed to become a professor, an associate professor at the University of Oregon, starting in 2026. As I said, I think this urban-rural divide, the book is called Rural versus Urban, and I think this divide is so central to our politics. I really appreciated the fact that you included in the book one of the most extraordinary quotes in American history that tells us that we have had this divide before. But I want to ask you what's different now and why it's important. The quotation is from William Jennings Bryan, who said, "Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country." So we've been here before, but this is different. Suzanne and then Trevor, talk about why you wrote this book and why you think this divide matters.
Well, we're in a time of high political polarization in the United States, but we wanted to delve into this geographic divide. And it's fascinating that, you read us the quote from William Jennings Bryan, and this was the period, the late 19th century, when industrialization was happening and rural people were feeling like they were being pushed more and more to the margins of the economy and society. But it was only in the 1990s that the United States developed a rural-urban political divide that cuts across the whole country. And what I mean by this is that in voting for president, it used to be, like through the middle of the 20th century, and right up to 1992, that there was only a tiny gap between rural and urban voters in presidential elections. But starting in 1996, it grew. It went from 2 percentage points in 1992 to today, it's in 2024, it was a 20 percentage point gap. And it's happened in all regions of the country and in almost all states. There's a big rural-urban divide. And it's really making for an us versus them politics in the United States.
Yeah, thanks, EJ, for the nice introduction. Yeah, and I would just add to Suzanne's great answer that one of the most important dynamics of the rural-urban divide is that because of longstanding American political institutions, it tends to give the party that dominates rural areas extra institutional power to advance public policies. And never before in American history has a single party dominated rural areas as they do now. And currently, the Republican Party does dominate rural areas. So we wouldn't argue that rural people are sort of dominating American politics, but in voting disproportionately or overwhelmingly for the Republican Party, they are granting them an extra amount of power. And we're seeing that power being used in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. presidency, and in the courts.
One of the things I appreciated about the book is the emphasis you put on economic change pretty much since the 80s and 90s, and the effect of that economic change on rural areas. And we should also say small town is part of this. Rural small town, at least I think, needs to be seen together. And yet, the general view is this is more about culture. First of all, talk about that economic change and why that has heightened this divide, and then maybe talk a bit about culture. And you argue that it's not just culture either. But let's start with economics, whichever of you wants to go first.
Yeah, so rural areas have historically always lagged a little bit behind urban areas, but really starting in the 1990s, we show with quantitative data and some qualitative case studies, interviews with local leaders, that starting in the 1990s, with the implementation of the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, the deregulation of the financial sector, the economy in rural areas really started to bottom out. We historically think of sort of manufacturing being in urban areas, but in fact, a lot of manufacturing in the United States was in rural areas for a very long time. So the combination of deregulation and deindustrialization, we argue, ends up systematically harming rural areas. In turn, we show that rural areas began to view the Democratic Party, who was in power at the time that a lot of these policies were in place, as not representing their interests anymore. So we show that things like job loss and population loss, which are systematically associated with, which tend to be good measures of economic deprivation, are systematically then associated in rural areas with Republican vote choice. No, so a lot of people will assume that the rural-urban divide is sort of about differences in public opinion. We show that we looked at the data extensively, and we found that to just be wrong. So on questions related to the size of government, questions related to spending on education, healthcare, even policing, the differences between rural and urban residents is quite tiny, if existent at all. Once you start adding in additional factors to account for age, education completely disappears. Now you might say, well, what about the culture war issues? What about abortion, LGBTQ rights, and so on and so forth? Immigration.
Right. By the way, gun control.
Gun control. We do find that there are some relatively small differences between, 2 and 10 percentage points. But, like once you, again, start controlling for other factors, those start to get smaller. And the bottom line is the gaps between rural and urban people on policy preferences just aren't big enough to account for the large gulf in political behavior we see. The last thing I'd add here is that while rural and urban people aren't divided over policy issues per se, they do view each other very in a very sort of hostile way. When asked to rate their or their out-partisans, so if you ask an urban Democrat to rate a Republican, they rate them quite low on a scale of 0 to 100, something like 13. And the number is very similar for rural people who are rating urban people. So people are bitterly divided over politics, but it's not necessarily policy.
Suzanne, could I ask you to follow up on that? If you talk, Trevor said important words, controlling for age and the like. And it struck me, I've been interested in this issue, as you have for a long time. And it strikes me that in rural America, there is a kind of cycle where rural America rural counties have become older in general because of a flight of young people to places where there's more economic opportunity for them. And this kind of creates a double effect, which is, on the one hand, older voters have tended to be, for the most part, more Republican in recent elections. But also this creates a lot of anger in those communities, because when young people leave, you sense that your community is dying or declining. Can you talk about that dynamic, that age dynamic that's going on, urban, rural?
Yeah, sure. So part of the research that Trevor and I did involved driving around the country and going to rural counties, talking with political party county chairs, both Democrats and Republicans. And one of the things that was fascinating about that was how similar their answers were in describing their communities. And so many of them, when we would ask about how the economy was doing, what had changed in the community in the past decade or two, they would talk about young people moving away And, I remember one chair saying, why would they stay here? There's nothing for them here. But it was a great source of sadness to people that, their kids would grow up there and then move away. So it does leave behind a population that's older and that really feels like their community has been left behind in some sense. And so, as Trevor said, we do find that there's a shift in voting in those places where the population is stagnant or declining, of moving toward Republican voting.
You in the book, I think that's really important. In the book, you play down culture, race, and the like in making a difference, but you also note, for example, that this divide seemed to accelerate after 2008. And you talk about the Tea Party movement in 2010, which I think was an important piece of this shift. I think there'll be debate. There is a lot of debate about attitudes on race and among white voters in these counties. And, that date that you pick in the book is also the date that Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. Could you talk about, to what extent do we need to pay attention to racial politics here? And to what extent is our tendency to so emphasize that we forget about everything else? Maybe, Suzanne, you can take that if you could.
Sure. Yeah. So as Trevor was describing, the rural-urban divide initially opens up in the late 90s and early 2000s with the onset of this place-based inequality. And it's important to mention that because we see what happens next as being in response to that first stage. So in the next period, which is, as we measure it, 2008 to 2020, we see rural dwellers starting to resent the Democratic Party, which they increasingly see as having its center being people who are better off than themselves, people who have more education and have more comfortable lives. And they have this experience that these people are creating policies where they're telling them what to do. It feels like elite overreach. And so resentment really builds up, and then that deepens the rural-urban divide. And so we did look carefully at, do racist attitudes come into play here? A lot of people assume that the rural-urban divide is attributable to racism. When we look, at our first period, late 90s, early 2000s, we find that that's not the case. In fact, there was plenty of racism in American society, but you were as likely to encounter it in urban areas as in rural areas. So it wasn't driving the rural-urban divide. In the period from 2008 on, there's a small gap that appears between rural and urban non-Hispanic whites in racist attitudes or anti-Black attitudes. And it does become a factor in among various ones in driving the rural-urban divide. The way we understand it is in this framework of elite overreach, that rural people are getting the sense that rural white people at that point in time have the sense that the Democratic Party is prioritizing the needs of people of color in cities and maybe immigrants, but not them. And they feel that they're people in need as well, but their needs are being overlooked by the Democratic Party.
This is driven by what either Democrats did or the elites did, and how much of it is very conscious messaging from the Republican Party? Because in a way, across the board here, you're talking about class politics. The old class politics, which was about class, actually appealed on the Democrat, brought many voters to the Democrats. You look at the maps of the Roosevelt and Truman elections, and they did great in a lot of rural America. That begins to shift, actually, as you know, in 1960, the maps start changing as early as that. Kennedy's Catholicism may have played a role there. But the Republicans, realizing that they were losing with class politics, began to do a cultural politics attacks on a new class going back to Irving Kristol back in the 1970s, trying to sort of harden this divide, and that, if it's pure class politics, Democrats tended to do well. This other kind of politics benefited Republicans. How much of this is actually the behavior of the Democrats or the elites, and how much of it is really, very smart messaging by the Republican Party? Trevor, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. So when we think about American politics today, we do think that there is some role that elites are playing in sort of framing and activating these issues. If you look at the way that the Republican Party currently talks about cities, it currently talks about them as full of urban elites, and it currently talks about them as quote unquote crime-ridden, investment-ridden, to use one of President Trump's unfortunate phrasing. And a lot of that rhetoric does tend to be racialized. And we know from other researchers that cities tend to be coded as African American. So we do think there is a role that elites are playing here in deepening the sort of
well, which elites are you talking about there? I mean, because I think in the book, it really matters. Just to put my cards on the table, I'm very sympathetic to your argument that Democrats need to pay a lot more attention to rural areas for a whole bunch of reasons. But that word elites, what you just described are Republican or conservative elites.
Sure. Yeah. And what we sort of argue in the book is, or what we argue in the book is that the Democratic Party has sort of disappeared in rural areas. So elite messaging becomes much more effective in rural and urban areas when there's no longer a party there to fight back against it. So we talked to several Democratic local party leaders on the ground who noted that they lacked investment in their local party infrastructure, and they were constantly fighting, or not fighting, but they were trying to persuade people who had left the party because of these sort of, I would call them myths, stereotypes about urban areas, about Democrats, that if there was a more robust Democratic Party on the ground, sort of connecting them to politics, that sort of disinformation could be fought.
Suzanne, could you talk about that? One of the things I liked about the book is you, like our friend whom we admire, Theda Skocpol, you guys spent a lot of time talking to local political leaders, party chairs, underrated resource, by the way, I think, in research, because they know a lot about where they live. And talk about sort of more about the texture of that. And you've clearly seen a cycle of kind of disinvestment by the Democratic Party in these areas. And you talk about those interviews and what you came away with from that.
Well, I've enjoyed doing this entire project with Trevor, but the interviews with the county chairs was definitely the most fun part of it. And, driving thousands of miles in rural areas in several different states, it was really great. And the county chairs, they're wonderful. I mean, these people are all, in both parties, they're champions for democracy. They're trying to connect voters to politics. They're looking for candidates. They're really making it happen on the ground level. And they're volunteers, And so what we found was that, when you would talk to them about how is the economy doing, it was really striking again how both Democrats and Republicans would often start out by ticking off the names of all of these factories or manufacturers that used to exist in the local area with lots of good paying jobs with good benefits that some of their relatives had worked in. And then by the 90s, late 90s and early 2000s, those places closed, they shuttered their doors, they moved away, or they were left with just a skeleton crew. And so that was a big part of what they were telling us was about the decline in the economy. For the Republican Party chairs, they are more often fueled, even though like party organizing has become harder in the United States, the organizations have become weaker for half a century or more for the same reasons that lots of civic organizations have suffered. And yet the Republican Party has been helped by other organizations like evangelical churches, which are more prevalent in rural places, and gun groups affiliated with the National Rifle Association, like, your local Rod and Gun Club, groups like that. And those groups, we found in our research, help to connect the dots for voters and point the way toward the Republican Party. So they are portraying to people who live locally that their interests and their values are best served by the Republican Party. For Democrats used to be aided by labor unions in this way. But as deindustrialization occurred, labor unions became weaker, and including in rural areas. And so the Democratic Party, they would talk about just how hard things were. We would ask them, do you feel supported by the state level party? And to a person, they would say, no, they didn't. And they felt that the DNC didn't even, really respect the fact that they existed and were out there.
I think that's so important. Can you just a little bit more on that? Because after people read your book, as I mentioned to you, I think they should read the book by Lainey Newman and our friend Theda called Rust Belt Union Blues. That it does seem that the culture, and this is for either of you, the political culture of rural America has been transformed. The importance of outside messengers like conservative radio, conservative television, Fox News, and others is much more important absent certain organizing on the ground by labor, which doesn't just affect workplaces, but the communities themselves. Talk about, maybe I'll go to Trevor on this, talk about sort of changes on the ground in rural America over this period. You studied beyond, obviously, the big economic changes which feed these other changes.
Yeah, so the union point is really important. So I in my other research, I study labor politics and unions, and I was actually quite surprised. We tend to think of labor unions as largely existing in urban areas, but as it turns out, as manufacturing migrated to rural areas, a lot of labor unions also followed those manufacturing places. And we use an original data set to show that from the 1970s on, unions declined, at least as how we measure it, at a very similar rate in rural areas that they did in urban areas. Now you might ask, why does this matter? Well, there's a long literature showing that the unions do a few important things. Lainey Newman and Theda Skocpol's book shows that unions act as a sort of social fabric of people's lives in Rust Belt areas. They connect them to politics, and crucially, they connected them to the Democratic Party. This is especially true for people who have increasingly moved away from the Democratic Party. So white working class people with lower levels of education. There's a lot of quantitative evidence that suggests that union members in that sort of cohort, also if they're part of a union, are more likely to be attached to the Democratic Party. They also, as Suzanne mentioned, they also helped connect the dots and organize politics in a different way. Instead of organizing politics around anti-elite frustration in urban areas, they would often organize politics around sort of concrete workplace injustices and connect those back to the policies that the Democratic Party may or may not have been advancing. And the second point is unions at the local level played an important role as an organizational infrastructure for the Democratic Party. They would help do voter registration drives. They would help mobilize people and get them to the polls. So the decline of unions in rural areas is a really understated development in American politics, and one that we argue played a very important role in combination with the rise that Suzanne mentioned of these conservative organizations that push voters in the other way.
Jane, one of the things you talk about that's important is this is not unique to the United States. In fact, in the other Western European democracies, for example, you have seen this divide be very important in the rise of not only conservative politics, but actually far-right politics, often challenging traditional center-right parties. Maybe just briefly, what's similar and what's different about what's going on in the United States and in some of the other democracies?
Yeah, so here we look to scholarship by Jonathan Rodden at Stanford and his co-authors. He has looked at this quite a bit. He finds that the rural-urban divide has been growing everywhere in recent decades, but it's grown at a quicker pace and to a greater level in the United States than elsewhere. And then what Trevor and I add to this is, and I'm going to just, here amplify what he was saying right up at the top, is that the United States is quite unique in having all of these institutional arrangements that have always given extra political clout to less populated places, but never before have all of those levers been consolidated in one party, which is allowing that party to have an extra dollop of political power in the system generally. And it allows for minority rule to occur.
Dan, I think that's very, you're referring specifically, especially to the Senate and to the Electoral College, which amplifies rural areas. And again, when you look at the old maps, Democrats did just fine in a lot of those rural states.
Yeah.
In the Bryan quote I used at the beginning, they used to be stronger once upon a time in
Yes.
rural
Yeah.
America.
Exactly. Yeah. It used to be that, Democrats dominated in some rural places and Republicans in others. So they basically canceled out those advantages in our institutions. But now they're really consolidated for the Republicans.
What I'd like to ask is, as people have already heard, there are a lot of reasons why Democrats as a party should worry about this for their own long-term, political health, especially chances of ever having a decent majority in the U.S. Senate. But your argument is broader than that. This isn't just about the Democratic Party. This is about a real problem for our democracy. And could you talk about why you see this maybe I'll start with Suzanne and go back to Trevor, why you see this as a real fundamental threat to, the well-being of our democracy?
Yeah, it's creating this terrible us versus them politics, which is really dangerous in so many ways. I mean, for lawmakers, like we look at Congress quite extensively, and we see that Congress has become polarized by place, and it makes it much harder to come to policy agreements and to have the kind of politics where you might have a different view than me about a policy, but we're going to split the difference, work something out, and then move on. Instead, we're left with a lot of dysfunction. But then worse than that, it can really create circumstances where if you have a party for whom staying in power is more important than abiding by the basic rules and procedures of democracy, playing by the rules of the game, then that's very, very dangerous indeed.
Trevor, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add one point, which is, we argue in the book and heard from people on the ground that this is also the way the geography of this essentially creates one party rule in both rural and urban areas. We focus on rural areas. So if you think about a rural person who lives in a Republican dominated area, they currently have very little choice when they go to the ballot box. And they feel fairly disenfranchised because they have really no shot at sort of winning an election. They have no real political party that stands as a presence. And this isn't just rural white people, though it certainly is, who identify as Democrats, but there are also a lot of rural people of color out there who ultimately lack political voice because we currently have a system that allows political parties to dominate specific geographic regions. You could say the same thing about urban areas and Republicans. A lot of Republicans in urban areas in New York City, for example, have very little say when it comes to politics.
We had some correspondence before our chat, and I appreciated that you both sort of put some very topical questions on the table. And one that I wanted to raise, maybe a couple, but one for sure, is what's happening with competing gerrymanders. Texas moved to redraw lines to create 5 more Republican seats. California's got a referendum on the ballot that so far is ahead in the polls that will try to counter that by redrawing the district lines to create 5 more Democratic seats. And the very processes themselves have the possibility of aggravating these divides because the Republicans tend to chop up cities and throw them in with a lot of rural, sometimes suburban areas that sympathize with them. And Democrats tend to throw in some Republican rural areas with enough cities to create seats for them. Suzanne, if we keep going down this road, what the heck happens to us?
Yeah, well, it's really problematic. And but I think Democrats stand to lose in this race because of where their voters are. It's because of the rural-urban divide. So Democratic voters tend to be more to live, more densely in urban areas, and so there are the expression that's used by people who study this is there are wasted votes. So say you're a member of Congress, Democrat, running in an urban district, you might, trounce your opponent and win by something like, 65% of the vote. Basically, everyone over the 51%, they didn't need to come out to vote. They're wasted voters. And Democrats have a lot of wasted votes, so to speak. By contrast, those who support the Republican Party tend to be more evenly distributed across more of the landscape, the actual geographic landscape. And so it's easier for the Republicans to draw lots and lots of districts that benefit them, and harder for Democrats to do that if you're still going to be drawing districts that are, contiguous and have people living in an area where there's some kind of a community, et cetera.
I just want to underscore this because it's really important. EJ, you mentioned earlier that we think about the Senate as being especially lopsided. That's totally true. Democrats are systematically disadvantaged in the U.S. House of Representatives. There's good research. We do research showing that in the House of Representatives, as the rural-urban divide has grown, the sort of phenomena Suzanne mentioned gets worse. So as rural people shift to the Republican Party, Democrats waste more votes. The amount of votes they get nationwide doesn't translate into more seats. So this is really just not a long-term solution for the Democratic Party to try to compete on the national level. Really what we need is party building at the local level.
Let me close to ask both of you, maybe briefly, maybe first Trevor and then Suzanne. What can we do to reduce this? What steps can, not just political parties, but policy? I think many of us were struck by the fact that a lot of the Biden spending programs sent quite a bit of money into these rural areas, including red areas. If you look at the CHIPS or the environmental investments or the infrastructure investments, and yet it clearly did Democrats no immediate good in the sense that you actually saw shifts away. The election was close. We should always remember that. But the shifts tended to be away from the Democrats. But what, in terms of organizing policy and just the way we talk about each other in our country. What do you suggest? If it's okay, I'll go to Trevor briefly and then Suzanne to close our conversation. Trevor?
Yeah, so we definitely think public policy is very important. Rural areas, as we discussed at the top of the conversation, tend to be sort of economically disadvantaged. Some of the poorest areas in the country for both white Americans, Black Americans, Indigenous Americans are in rural areas. So we do think that advancing policies that uplift the economies of rural areas are key. We would never say anything to the contrary. However, we don't think that's sufficient. As it turns out, rural areas already disproportionately rely on things like federal social transfers. So like Medicaid, for example, Republicans recently passed a bill that's going to cut Medicaid, and that's probably disproportionately going to harm rural areas. They also disproportionately rely on public employment. Instead, what we argue is that Democrats really need to invest in local party building. They need to invest in year-round organizers who are preferably local residents, who have connected ties, who are in the day-to-day lives of people, to connect them to politics. And I'll let Suzanne add to that.
Suzanne, what a ringing effort to bring us together.
Yeah, well, everything that is happening on a day-to-day basis these days seems to be driving us apart. And, most recently with the president sending troops into so many American cities, and I think that is possible because of the rural-urban divide and the kind of us versus them feeling that has been developing for some time now. But Trevor's absolutely right. What we need is party building on the ground. And what I would say is that this has to include listening to rural people. There needs to be an effort to, for the Democratic Party to listen to what are people's needs and concerns. If they have felt frustrated with the Democratic Party, why? Let that be heard. And what's the way forward? And there needs to be a lot of listening and organizing. I think that the Democratic Party, these days is going through a period of a lot of consternation and talking about how messaging perhaps should be different, and a lot of questions about, party stances on issues. Trevor and I would say that what is missing from this conversation, and what we think is at least as important as those things, and perhaps more important, is party organizing. In rural places, there is a coalition waiting to be built with urban areas, but there have to be people on the ground there to do it.
Just at a time when a lot of people wonder what they can be hopeful about, I really liked the last paragraph of your book, so I just want to close with your last paragraph. Despite the challenges faced in rural places, those who have chosen to live in them are glad they did. Said one party chair after another, I love it here, and the best decision I ever made was to move here. And by the way, dear New Yorkers, I love New York City, so this is not an argument that you should move somewhere else, but this close is very powerful because you continue. They have invested precious time and energy in the civic renewal of their communities, and their efforts, if bolstered and supported, may revitalize the nation as a whole. The call for civic action in this book is so important. I'm really grateful you wrote it, and it's been a real joy to talk with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, EJ. It's been a joy to chat with you.
Thanks, EJ. This has been fantastic.
Hello out there. My name is Akhil Amar. I'm a professor of constitutional law at Yale College and Yale Law School. And today it's my great good fortune, my privilege, my honor to be with one of my favorite students of all time, former students, the great Jeff Rosen, who, among other accolades, is the president of the National Constitution Center. And Jeff is going to be here with me for the next hour or so, talking about his latest book, The Pursuit of Liberty. And the subtitle is How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle over power in America. Jeff, it's such a pleasure to be back with you.
Akhil, it is a joy to be with you, and I cannot wait for our conversation.
A couple of things just to get us started. One, Jeff, I mentioned the title of the book, The Pursuit of Liberty. Now, that title bears a certain similarity to the title of another book that you authored. I think it was actually a New York Times bestseller. Congratulations, may this one be in the same tradition. Would you tell us a little bit about that one and whether it is indeed in any way connected to this one, except other than title? And just to repeat, that one was called The Pursuit of Happiness.
Absolutely. This book is indeed connected. The Pursuit of Happiness, The Pursuit of Liberty, and are going to be a trilogy. And the next installment will be The Pursuit of Union. The Pursuit of Happiness was a book about the reading list that Thomas Jefferson used to inspire his understanding of the pursuit of happiness, not as feeling good, but as being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. I was inspired to write the happiness book by discovering that both Jefferson and Ben Franklin had chosen as their definition of the pursuit of happiness a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. I decided to read Cicero and then other books that Jefferson had identified as the key books of moral philosophy or ethics that inspired him. And I spent a year during COVID reading moral philosophy. Akhil, I noted that I'm so grateful to you for having inspired my love of the Constitution and history and political philosophy, but I'd never read these books of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum by the time you and I were studying together in law school and when I was in college. And this experience of a year of deep reading changed my life. It changed the way I think about how to be a good person and a good citizen. It helped me understand that for the founders, happiness meant not immediate gratification, but self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement, and lifelong learning. And that for the founders, personal self-government was necessary for political self-government. In other words, unless we mastered our unreasonable passions and emotions, we couldn't achieve the calm tranquility that allowed us to be our best self and serve others and resist our most factionate or partisan impulses. So that was the happiness book. It was extremely meaningful for me to write. And I do want to share the takeaway for me from writing it. I'm no longer getting up 2 hours before dawn and reading moral philosophy, which I spent a year doing. But I do have a rule that when I wake up in the morning, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've read books. And it's a life hack because I'd fallen out of the habit of deep reading. I read with you in law school, Akhil, and read when I was a kid. But because I'm so addicted to these screens, I found myself browsing and surfing and not reading except for immediate deadlines. And it's been totally transformative. It's that new habit that allowed me to write the Hamilton Jefferson book. It's allowed me to wake up every morning and be eager to learn something new. And you and I both share the conviction that one of the great threats to our republic today is that people are not reading. They're not reading books. And it's not just people who lack opportunities. It's you and I and all of us because we're so tethered to our screens. So we're both evangelists for deep reading and lifelong learning, and that's why I'm so glad to be talking to you about both of these books.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the pursuit of happiness. We're going to talk for most of our session about the pursuit of liberty. Did you want to say anything about the pursuit of union, or do you want to wait until we finish volume 2 before we preview volume 3?
Let's wait to preview it. Maybe I could just share how I came to write The Pursuit of Liberty as a follow-up. I was reading a historian from the Progressive era, Herbert Croly, who called on Theodore Roosevelt to deploy Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends. In other words, the Hamiltonian means of strong federal power to achieve the Jeffersonian ends of promoting democracy and curbing monopolies and corporations. And I was so struck that Theodore Roosevelt not only read that, but he embraced it in launching his new nationalism. And he said, I am a Hamiltonian with regard to my views on federal power, but a Jeffersonian in terms of my commitment to democracy. And then I wondered whether anyone else had matched Hamilton and Jefferson in describing American politics, and was very struck to discover that it was at the center of the first account of America's political parties. Martin Van Buren, who wrote a history of America's political parties, said that they went back to the initial battle between Hamilton and Jefferson about democracy versus aristocracy. And then I discovered that John Quincy Adams, in his great address on the Jubilee of the Constitution, traced the birth of the parties back to Hamilton and Jefferson's disagreement about national power versus states' rights. So seeming that Hamilton and Jefferson was so crucial in American history, I wondered whether there was any book that had traced the history of their battle over time. And I was really surprised that no one seems to have done that. There are great separate books on the images of Hamilton and Jefferson separately. Merrill Peterson has a great view on the Jefferson image in the American mind, and Stephen Knott, a great book about the myth, Hamilton and the Myth of America. But no one just kind of put the words into word searches. And inspired, as always, Akhil, by your example, I've become so committed to going back to the primary texts. So that's what I decided to do. And once again, what I discovered blew my mind. It's so exciting to study the primary text because it always surprises you the more you learn. And what I found that far from being isolated examples, invocations of Hamilton and Jefferson are everywhere at all the crucial turning points of American history. Lincoln stands in front of Independence Hall in 1861 and says, "I've never had a thought politically that didn't flow from Jefferson. I'd rather be assassinated on the spot than abandon the principles of the Declaration of Independence." James Garfield leads a Hamilton revival after reading the works of Hamilton and puts him at the center of Reconstruction. Franklin Roosevelt reads a book called Hamilton versus Jefferson and invites the author, Claude Bowers, to speak to the Democratic Convention, and then decides to reinvent the Democratic Party as the party of Jeffersonian democracy rather than limited government. And then Ronald Reagan says that he left the Democratic Party because it had abandoned the principles of Jefferson and limited government. So they're like golden and silver threads woven throughout American history. That's the image that came to my mind. Sometimes Hamilton and Jefferson's ideas cross, sometimes they pull apart, sometimes so far that they seem to snap. But it is the productive tension between the competing ideals of Hamilton and Jefferson that have kept American politics from descending into violence from the beginning. And that's why it's so urgently important and also so exciting to study their ideas today.
So you use the metaphor in the book and just now of gold and silver threads, connected to your earlier book, which is part about, a philosophy of life. I kind of thought, and maybe this is an Eastern metaphor of Jefferson and Hamilton as the yin and yang of the American constitutional discourse. Now, Jeff, here's one interesting transition that you've made. In the last book, if I remember rightly, you really focused on 6 founders, especially. They're often called the Big Six. It's interesting. They're the 6 who are preeminent in a book that I wrote called The Words That Made Us. But I don't think it's unique to you and me. I think if we did a Family Feud survey says kind of poll, just name an important founder, I think by acclamation, the Big Six would be the ones that you focused on in the pursuit of happiness. Our first 4 presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and our 2 founding geniuses. This is how I think of it, Franklin and Hamilton. Now, I think those were the 6 that you talked about, especially about their ideas about virtue and how to lead a good inner life and the connections perhaps between one's own self-government and collective self-government. Now you've gone, for reasons you've begun to explain, from the Big Six to these 2. Have I got that basically right?
Yes, you have. Okay.
So here's my take on some of this. Just in some ways, I am a particular. I'm a Hamiltonian in various ways, not in every way, because it's yin and yang. We need them both. But one thing that I tried to emphasize is they're actually dyads and trios sometimes, and quartets, and these initial six work together sometimes, they pull apart sometimes, but there is, I think, a particular team that does emerge between Hamilton and Washington, kind of son-father team, and a kind of maybe a little bit more older brother, younger brother team between Jefferson and Madison. And I mentioned this because in some of your chapters, and I think we're going to get into them very shortly, especially about the bank, it's not just, in my view, Jefferson versus Hamilton. It's actually Jefferson versus Washington. Because Washington is really on Hamilton's side on a bunch of things. He picks them both in his first cabinet, and Franklin isn't in the cabinet. Franklin is about to die, when Washington becomes president. And Madison isn't in the cabinet. He's in the first Congress, and he first starts working kind of with Washington, and then begins to separate himself a bit from Washington. And Adams is kind of always off on his own. Adams is not a team player quite. He's a bit of a loner. The way it's formulated sometimes, I just want you to comment a little bit on how Washington, well, I think, and I hope especially in the Pursuit of Union, Washington becomes a key figure in Volume 3, how Washington drops out a little bit, and it seems sometimes in your narrative as it's Hamilton versus Jefferson, and we forget actually on most things, Washington actually backed Hamilton.
Absolutely right, Akil, of course. And as you say, in the end, Washington is the greatest American, the greatest Federalist, and the greatest emblem of Union. And at the same time, Madison is crucial in always negotiating between the extremes of Hamilton and Jefferson, embracing compromises that are sometimes so technical that only he can understand them, over interposition and the status of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and indeed over the bank. And he's the model for compromise and conciliation that ultimately makes him my great hero as a constitutional exemplar. But Hamilton and Jefferson are the defining poles of American politics. They're the ones who are actually invoked for the next 200 years. And they're invoked by name, perhaps because they represent the extremes over at least three crucial battles that have defined American politics ever since. First, national power versus states' rights. Second, executive power versus judicial power. And third, liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution. And we can talk about all of those, but ultimately, I have concluded that it was Hamilton and Jefferson's battle over the constitutionality of the bank that really has defined our essential constitutional disputes ever since. Hamilton, of course, embraces a liberal construction in his memo to Washington, Jefferson strict construction. Washington sides with Hamilton, and so does John Marshall. And that tradition of great nationalists from Washington to Hamilton to Marshall to Webster to Lincoln is one that you've done so much to defend and inspire us to learn about. But that's the reason that, while completely agreeing with you, of course, that the realities of politics in the Federalist period involved Washington and Madison playing as large or even larger roles than Jefferson and Hamilton. It's Hamilton and Jefferson who've defined the poles of our intellectual battles in ways that have led them to be invoked by name ever since.
So I hope to get especially to Lincoln, and you've mentioned even Franklin Roosevelt, and in between, actually in the book, Theodore Roosevelt and Crowley and others. So maybe we can work our way forward in time, but I just can't resist the provocation of returning to our days together in the classroom, and we started with McCulloch versus Maryland and debates about the bank. I'm basically with Hamilton on that, and not just therefore Washington and John Marshall, but just to stack the deck in my favor, just to remind the audience, oh, it's not just John Marshall, it's the unanimous Supreme Court which is filled with people who actually been put on the court by Jefferson and his acolyte, Madison. And that's because, on my view, Jefferson was actually at least trebly, maybe quadruply, maybe quintuply wrong. I'll put forth my view just to get a dialectic going, back and forth. But Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the bank, which you've connected to both, and they're related questions: national versus state power and strict versus liberal construction, on your view, or liberal versus strict construction. National state power, liberal versus strict construction.
Absolutely. But first, to go back to our treasured time together when I was in law school and you were starting off teaching, you remember a classmate bet me to stand up in class and declare out of the blue, Jefferson is the Antichrist. And I did that. And it reflected your view that he was on the wrong side of all of the constitutional debates that we were studying. And in this book,
not on speech and some others, but at least on the bank, at least on the bank.
On the bank. So this conversation we've been having goes back to our time together almost 3 decades ago. In this book, I set out not to take sides in the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson. I say at the very beginning, unlike previous historians like Henry Cabot Lodge and Claude Bowers, who've been unapologetic partisans for their favorite founder and have also tended to exalt his manliness in the spirit of their times and denigrate his rival. My goal as an intellectual historian in this book is simply to describe the debates, not to put my thumb on the scales. And one reason I did that is that both have been invoked by both parties throughout American history in ways that are constantly switching sides and often invoking them for partisan purposes. So just to take the most famous example, Jefferson himself, having defended limited national power and questioned the constitutionality of the bank, then goes on, becomes president, and buys Louisiana and embraces the same liberal construction of the Constitution that he previously rejected. Even though he thinks there's a constitutional amendment necessary, he swallows his constitutional scruples in the interests of what he thinks are the public good. And then he switches again when the Louisiana Purchase is embraced and the Missouri Compromise is proposed, and goes back to a strict construction of the Territories Clause. Like Jefferson himself, constantly switching between liberal and strict construction to achieve his partisan goals, so have both political parties throughout history, often opportunistically choosing how to construe the necessary and proper clause throughout. But what's so striking is this is America's central constitutional debate. And you're right, descriptively, that history has tended to favor Marshall and Hamilton and Washington's interpretation, and those who have embraced strict rather than liberal construction are on the side of Chief Justice Taney in the Dred Scott case, or Justice Bradley in the civil rights cases, striking down the core bits of Reconstruction, or the justices who struck down the New Deal, whereas the broad constructionists have tended to be on the side of that history has judged to be the correct one. But my goal in the book is really to describe the battles rather than to tell people what to think about them. And I'm just so struck by the fact that this is the essential battle in American politics, not the battle between originalism and non-originalism, or among theories of interpretation beyond liberal versus strict construction. And it's just very, very striking how many of the battles have gone back to a debate about the meaning of the necessary and proper clause itself.
It's a very powerful through line throughout all of history, very illuminating. I'm going to come back to the partisan thing later and invite you to tell us also a little bit about the National Constitution Center, because I think given that even on the cover of the book, your status as president and CEO of the National Constitution Center is mentioned, and that's a famously nonpartisan entity, it does actually perhaps influence the kind of books you might want to write, as president and CEO, even though you're writing in your own name and not on behalf of the Constitution Center. So we may come back to that. But this point about partisanship, and how both parties have sometimes used parts of Hamilton and parts of Jefferson is partly what I was getting at with this yin and yang thing, that you need both. You can't do without one. Yes, on the bank, I'm totally with Hamilton and Marshall and Washington, but not on everything else, not on the Sedition Act. We need Jefferson. We need democracy. We need Louisiana. We need lots of, and the idealism that the young Jefferson has, especially on so many things, but anti-slavery. Here's my different narrative, because I don't have to be as nonpartisan as you're aspiring to be, both in your capacity as president and CEO of the National Constitution Center and as an author. So here's my take on the bank and Jefferson. Yeah, so Jefferson went back and forth for a couple of reasons, because Jefferson had stupid principles, but happily was a hypocrite, especially when he was in power. So he goes back and forth and doesn't bind himself to the stupid principles that he articulates. So, so that's why he's against the bank, but then Madison changes his mind on stuff and he's for broad power when it comes to Louisiana. So there's Jefferson's bad principles that he doesn't apply against himself. And my second claim, this is far more partisan take on the whole thing, is that Jefferson gets worse on slavery as time passes, because he founds a political party, and it's a Southern-based pro-slavery political party, and he goes with this party rather than his best self. And so as he ages, he gets worse. And this is, Jeff, responsive to your first book, where you're talking about lives and leading lives and life arcs, because truthfully, I have come to respect Jefferson less as a human being, because actually his life arc is down. He lies about slavery and all sorts of things in his own life, and I see other founders of having more of an upward arc. Washington isn't perfect, but he gets better on the slavery issue as time goes on. I think Franklin gets better and wiser. Madison and Jefferson both really disappoint me as their lives proceed on the slavery issue. So I've been very influenced by your last book and thinking about their private lives as well as their public contributions. But on the bank, here's my take. It's a slightly different one, but just for the audience to get, again, a yin and yang, sort of a back and forth. So Jefferson first says stuff like the following, and it just doesn't make sense to me. Okay, he says, well, the word bank isn't mentioned in the Constitution. Fine, lots of things aren't mentioned. And then he says, if it's not mentioned, it has to be indispensably necessary. Okay, and I'm thinking that can't be the test. Suppose there's a clause in the Constitution. It doesn't specify how it's to be implemented. There are only two ways of implementing it. No matter which one you pick, someone could say, well, you could have picked the other one, so neither is indispensable. So that's just silly as a test. It is as this logical, without which the power would be nugatory something. That can't be right. You look at every statute that's ever passed from the first one on, Congress actually specifies an oath of office, well, for members of Congress. Well, that's not indispensably necessary. Congress has all sorts of early laws about lighthouses and buoys for interstate shipping. Well, that's not logically necessary. So Jefferson has this utterly idiotic test. It would make everything unconstitutional. And Jefferson actually thinks that all banks are Ponzi schemes. He does. He doesn't understand actually what a bank is, that it actually lends out money even though it doesn't have all the money in the vault. So that's crazy. Then he also doesn't understand actually how banks are indispensable to national security, because he wasn't there at Valley Forge the way Washington and Hamilton were. So there's a reason I say that Washington, sides against Jefferson, that not just Hamilton, and not just Marshall, but all the justices of the Supreme Court, most of whom are picked by Jefferson and Madison themselves. Why Madison himself changes his mind late in life and signs in a bank statute into law, even though, and he says, it's because he doesn't want to admit that he was wrong from the beginning. But he was wrong from the beginning. And finally, what I try to show is Madison, who's working with Jefferson against the bank, is doing it for the most narrow and parochial purposes. The bank, if it exists, is going to be located in Philadelphia. That's not going to be good for Madison's plan to locate the national capital on the banks of the Potomac, because if the bank is in Philadelphia, the Treasury Department is going to probably be in Philadelphia. That's a huge part of the federal bureaucracy, and that will create pressure to actually keep the federal capital in Philadelphia. And all the votes against the bank come from Virginia and Maryland, and that's what it's all about. And then when Madison is president, where he's no longer having to worry about this stupid little Virginia constituency, he changes his mind totally. So I'm very ungenerous, I admit. I'm more partisan on this, on the bank. And Jeff, you have a very high-minded, and fair-minded, I think, account of, but you're trying to give the argument on both sides. But this debate actually about Jefferson and Hamilton, is a debate, between us that goes back many years.
It does indeed, but I really want to emphasize the power of studying both Jefferson and Hamilton, because they have continued to be invoked by people throughout American history, regardless of what you or I may think of the merits of their arguments at any moment in time. Jefferson is a protean figure. That's a phrase that comes from Merrill Peterson, the great intellectual historian of Jefferson. And he notes that the different aspects of Jefferson have been invoked by all sides at different times. So Franklin Roosevelt, running in 1932 as a Jefferson limited government guy, amazingly criticizing Herbert Hoover for expanding the size of the federal government, then reads Claude Bowers on Jefferson versus Hamilton and decides to reinvent Jefferson as the prophet of democracy rather than limited government. And he puts Jefferson on the nickel, and he builds the Jefferson Memorial, and he invokes Jefferson in all of his speeches, and he reinvents Jefferson as the improbable champion of the New Deal administrative state. And what's so important about this is that there are aspects of Jefferson that have appealed to defenders of broad national government, and also to expanding the promise of the Declaration of Independence from the beginning. You can also take the fact that, while completely agreeing with you that Jefferson became worse on slavery, he calcified in his commitment to restricting the ability to stop it and to allow it to spread across the West. And of course, he didn't free his own enslaved population, aside from his own kids, keeping his promise to Sally Hemings, and his exaltation of frugality and avoidance of debt was revealed to be a sham based on his own extravagant living and addiction to luxury. As if that's not bad enough, to see his reaction to Phyllis Wheatley in the Notes on the State of Virginia, whose genius was acclaimed by Washington and Franklin, but Jefferson denigrates her talent as the first Black published poet because of his racism. All of this is not to Jefferson's credit. Nevertheless, Jefferson is the essential inspiration for the end of slavery, and it's the Declaration that's invoked by brave African Americans, from Prince Hall to David Walker to all the way up to Martin Luther King on the Mall. So for me, and the goal of this book is, rather than judging the merits of these men at any particular point in time, is to see how they've inspired others and how they've been invoked. And what is even more striking to me than where you come down on the merits of strict versus liberal construction at any moment in history is that Hamilton and Jefferson have defined the terms of our debate. And it's simply extraordinary and extremely relevant that as late as our current debates on the Supreme Court, including the debates over the Affordable Care Act, or even the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act, it's versions of that same debate over how strictly to construe the word necessary and what's appropriate and congruent that both sides are disagreeing about. So that's why it's so exciting for me also to offer up this narrative to readers, so that everyone can make up his or her own mind And throughout American history, people have been drawn to Jefferson and Hamilton at different times. For me, the more you learn about them and in all their complexities and contradictions, it's hard to take sides entirely because both have much to inspire, but they provide a framework for our debate. And it's the debate that inspires us to learn more about the principles of the Constitution, because those principles, the productive tension between the principles of Hamilton and Jefferson, are what prevents American politics from descending into violence. It's really at the moments in American history that we've abandoned the principles of Jefferson and Hamilton that the shooting has begun. And that's why it's so important to learn about their debate in all of its complexity.
So that was great, Jeff. And you've already mentioned, okay, an early controversy, the bank. You've talked about 20th century stuff like Franklin Roosevelt and even the modern Supreme Court, Affordable Care Act. The book also has some very interesting things to say about episodes between the bank and, let's say, Franklin Roosevelt. So I want to invite you to tell us a little bit about, for example, the Aaron Burr controversy, but especially actually about Dred Scott and Lincoln. We can't kind of, and then I know you have some Reconstruction stuff as well, but Aaron Burr, at least a little bit, but especially on Roger Taney and Dred Scott and Abraham Lincoln and their uses of Jefferson and Hamilton.
Thank you so much for asking. And let's first talk about Burr. The book begins with the following scene, the dinner party that defined America. Washington is away. The cabinet gathers at Jefferson's house. This is a dinner a year after the famous one in the room where it happened on Maiden Lane, where they moved the capital to Philadelphia and then DC in exchange for assuming the national debt. This is also at Jefferson's house. At one point, Hamilton looks around the room and says to Jefferson, "Who are those three guys on the wall?" Jefferson says, "They're my three visions of the greatest men in history, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." Hamilton pauses for a while and then blurts out, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." And Jefferson writes in his diary, this proves that Hamilton was not only for a monarchy, but a monarchy bottomed on corruption. And he goes on to found the Democratic Republican Party in supposed opposition to the alleged Caesarism of Hamilton and the Federalists. What makes the story so striking is that Hamilton was almost certainly joking. As Ron Chernow notes, he spent his life denouncing the dangers of Caesarism. In Federalist 22, he says, imagine that Shays' rebellion had been led by a Catiline or a Caesar. The Republic might have fallen in its cradle. And Hamilton wants to respond to the threats of Caesarism by creating a strong executive elected for life, who won't have the temptation to flatter the people and persuade them to exchange their liberty and consolidate power. Jefferson also fears Caesar, but from above rather than below. He thinks that Caesar will lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, and refuse to leave office.
That could never happen, Jeff.
It could never happen on a nonpartisan basis. He wants to have a one-year term limit for the president rather than a life term, so the president can't try to subvert an election. But what's so important about this story is that both Hamilton and Jefferson fear Caesarism, and they think they found a crypto Caesar in Aaron Burr. As Hamilton so memorably says, if we have a crypto Caesar, 'tis Burr. Hamilton accurately suspects that Burr is conspiring to lead a secessionist movement in Spanish Louisiana and set himself up as Emperor of Mexico. Henry Adams finds a letter in the archives of the British ambassador that confirms that Burr had offered his services to the British in exchange for support in setting himself up as a kind of would-be dictator of a secessionist state. And even though he may not be technically guilty of treason, as John Marshall concludes, he's almost certainly conspiring to subvert the Republic. And for me, it's quite inspiring that both Hamilton and Jefferson, despite their intense dislike of each other, ultimately converge in their even greater suspicion of Burr because they're patriots. And Hamilton nobly prefers Burr over Jefferson in the election of 1800. He doesn't trust Jefferson, but he thinks that
prefers Jefferson over Burr.
Over Burr. he believes that Jefferson is committed to the survival of the republic, whereas Burr is a crypto Caesar, and Jefferson agrees.
So Jeff, just to pause on that, just to remind our audience, Jefferson and Burr run as a tag team for the presidency. And the understanding, this is in 1801, is that Jefferson's going to be the president and Burr the vice president, but technically they tie in the Electoral College. And so that's going to need to be untied by Congress. And the Congress is controlled sort of by the lame duck allies of Hamilton, the Federalist Party. And Hamilton intervenes basically with his Federalist pals saying, we should support Jefferson rather than Burr. Everyone knows I don't love Jefferson, but Jefferson is a patriot and has principles in the end, and Burr is not and has none, and Burr is a threat to the Republic, and Jefferson, I actually think, will be a good enough president because he's a sufficiently high-minded principal. So Hamilton throws his weight in support of Jefferson and throws the election Jefferson's way, because even though they disagree about certain things, they actually both believe in the Republic. Have I got that basically right?
You got it exactly right. And it's really striking that Burr is the cautionary tale of the crypto Caesar throughout the rest of American history. So what is it that Burr wants to do? He wants to subvert democratic elections, set himself up as a dictator, consolidate all power in his own hands, and subvert the separation of power. And that's what makes the debate for the rest of American history about who is the new Burr so significant. So, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Akhil, but of course, Andrew Jackson is assaulted as a would-be Caesar, King Andrew, who's trying to consolidate all power in his own hands. Lincoln, during the Civil War, of course, is attacked as a kind of military dictator. Franklin Roosevelt is so often attacked as Caesar that he dresses up as Julius Caesar in 1934, and Eleanor dresses like a Roman matron, and he kind of makes fun of the whole thing. But it seemed to me that the two figures in American history who were most Burr-like in their aspiration to subvert the separation of powers and consolidate their own dictatorial authority were two governors of Louisiana, Henry Clay Warmoth and Huey Long. And Huey Long, of course, is familiar as the Kingfisher, and he, in Louisiana, wants to attack judicial independence and allow himself to throw elections and run the place like a one-party dictatorship, which is why Franklin Roosevelt thinks he's the most dangerous man in America, followed only by Douglas MacArthur. And Henry Clay Warmoth is really a less-known predecessor, but I was so struck by the fact that Warmoth, who is also a kind of populist, he's praised for cleaning the streets and giving benefits to the poor. He is at the center of this violent election of 1872, among the most violent in American history, where both sides claim victory, and it ends up with the Battle of New Orleans, armed troops in the streets of New Orleans, as well as culminating the Colfax massacre, among the bloodiest in American history, where African-American men are burned defending a courthouse that was claimed by the Republicans. And it's ultimately, they're prosecuted, and the Supreme Court throws out the conviction in one of the most scandalous cases in all of Supreme Court history. And it's just a sign of the dangers of politicians who don't respect democracy and are ultimately willing to use violence to consolidate their power. So what do you think about Long and Warmoth as a kind of crypto Caesar cautionary tales? And are there any other crypto Caesars in American history?
Well, I'm going to now be a little provocative, perhaps, but because I also, wanted you to talk a little bit more about Lincoln. I want to say that Jefferson, and I know your name is Jeff, and I know he's Jefferson, but his namesake, Jefferson Davis, you see, led an insurrection against a duly elected government. And I think he was like Burr. I think he was worse than Burr because he was technically a traitor. He committed, in my view, technical treason. He took up arms against a duly elected constitutional regime and thought of himself Jeff, maybe wrongly, but in the tradition of his namesake. Jefferson, penned the Declaration of Independence, and he's declaring his independence, that is Jefferson Davis, from the central regime. The difference is that no one voted for King George III or Parliament, no one in America, but Americans did vote for Abraham Lincoln and his party in 1860-61. So I would say, if we're continuing the story of Aaron Burr, my candidate, for a villain of the century, would be a Jefferson Davis, who saw himself, perhaps wrongly, as very much in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson, and this is, I hope, going to be at least part of your volume 3, which you haven't written yet, on Union. Jefferson was not as great, in my view, on Union as Hamilton, as Washington, and even Madison was way better, I think, at the end of the day, on secession and nullification than his friend, his kind of adopted older brother, Thomas Jefferson. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. You have argued to me so persuasively. We've been having this debate ever since law school about whether or not secession was constitutional or not. And although I think that it was more intensely contested from the beginning about whether we, the people of the United States, or we, the states, were sovereign, you've shown me that Madison believed that although there was a kind of dual sovereignty with each body remaining sovereign within his own spheres, ultimately Madison concluded that secession was unconstitutional because states couldn't unilaterally leave the union that they'd joined. And Jefferson is an outlier here, and in endorsing first nullification and then secession with a kind of radical vision of state sovereignty, he is taking a position that's rejected by Madison and ultimately repudiated at Antietam on the field of battle. And you're also right that the South invoked Jefferson as a hero, and Jefferson Davis is absolutely a kind of crypto Burr figure, and he's abetted by other Southern enslavers, such as John Calhoun, another villain of the book, who remarkably switches from nationalism and support of tariffs to radical states' rights secessionism and opposition to tariffs because of his determination to preserve the slavocracy, and really significantly moves beyond Jefferson, who'd always insisted that slavery violated the Declaration and natural law, to defending slavery as a positive good. And it is Calhoun's decision to reject the principles of the Declaration and to insist that they are self-evident lies, and to embrace the idea that all men are not created equal, that leads to a break with Jefferson that takes him outside of the liberal tradition. And that's why the slavocracy is so striking, both in embracing Jefferson's radical visions of states' rights and state sovereignty, while rejecting Jefferson's embrace of the universal principles of the Declaration. But isn't it significant? It just is yet another dramatic illustration of the point that the battles between Hamilton and Jefferson are on both sides of the Civil War. And as Merrill Peterson reminds us, both the enslavers and the abolitionists are invoking Jefferson. And then to bring us to Lincoln, which I know we want to talk about, isn't it significant that Lincoln, the great opponent who comes to be the defender of national power, the opponent of slavery, himself embraces not Hamilton, but Jefferson as his model. He's the one who says in 1861, "I've never had a thought politically that didn't come from Jefferson." Why is that? It's so striking that in Lincoln's speeches, we have scores of reference to Jefferson and a handful, less than 10 references to Hamilton. Well, part of it is the fact that his name was politically toxic when Lincoln comes of age. The Federalist Party was dead, and there's no stock in embracing Hamilton. There's also the fact that the Whig Party is founded on the principles of purist Jeffersonianism. Henry Clay is one of Lincoln's great heroes, and Clay, who studies with George Wythe, Jefferson's own law tutor, considers himself a Jeffersonian of the most determined kind, a national power Jeffersonian, but who's also committed to the principles of Jefferson agrarianism and expanded democracy. And that's why Jefferson is such a hero to Lincoln, who says that he praised Jefferson in theory, although he came to distrust him in practice after reading about his private life and his enslaving practices in biographies. So it's a really striking fact that during the time when Jefferson was ascendant, during the era of good feeling, when Lincoln comes of age, everyone is a Jeffersonian among the Whigs, and then in the South, both the enslavers and the opponents of slavery are Jeffersonian too. It's a reminder of Jefferson's protean qualities. There is something in him for everyone. But to bring this back to your initial thought, I completely agree that if you want a villain in American history, it's those Southern enslavers who are rejecting the Declaration and defending secession.
So we're going to move toward a conclusion, but here's my take on all that. Jeff, the biggest claim, I think, of the book, and I think you made it clear in our conversation, is you can't think about American history since the founding without especially thinking about these two people, especially if you're thinking about Americans' kind of a two-party evolving system, and the yin and the yang are Hamilton and Jefferson, and they just come up in all sorts of ways in every era. So my take, my version of what you just said is Jefferson is definitely on both sides of the Civil War, in that he says all men are created equal, and Lincoln has a very robust understanding of that and says, I have Jefferson on my side. But Jefferson's also a secessionist, okay, or a proto-secessionist, and so Jefferson Davis says we're declaring independence in the same way that the colonies did, and so we're claiming Jefferson, and I claim his name, says Jefferson Davis, and Tawney says, oh, Congress has no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. Now, Jefferson early on actually is the author of the Northwest Ordinance, which becomes a statute prohibiting slavery in the territories. But Jefferson and Madison late in life say, oh, Congress shouldn't prohibit slavery in the territories in the Missouri Compromise. So Jefferson's on sort of both sides of that, the Free Soil Lincoln side and the Roger Taney side. You might think Hamilton is completely on Lincoln's side. Lincoln maybe doesn't mention Hamilton, but as a Whig, you said, well, the Whigs kind of descend in part from Jefferson and Clay, but they also believe in internal improvements, and that's very much a Hamiltonian idea. And well, the early Lincoln believes in canals and banks, and very much Hamilton, whether he mentions them or not. Okay, but Hamilton is very much the nationalist, so no one could ever think that Hamilton believes in secession. But here's the kick in the head. Since I mentioned Jefferson Davis, I talk about this in the new book, Born Equal. Yeah, the guy who actually says, all men are created equal, that doesn't include blacks, Alexander Stephens, Jefferson Davis's partner in crime. He's the vice president of the Confederacy. So, he's in the Aaron Burr, villain tradition, in my view, on slavery and on secession. His full name is Alexander Hamilton Stephens. So you just, Alexander Hamilton Stephens and Jefferson Davis, those are the vice president and the president of the Confederacy. That proves your point.
It really does. And Akil, it's so wonderful to talk always about history with you and to share our sense of how exciting and complicated the history is, and people constantly switching sides and betraying their principles and embracing the principles of their opponents. But how exciting and ultimately inspiring that throughout history, both sides have been inspired by these pole stars, Hamilton and Jefferson. And I left this project ultimately inspired by what deep readers in history people have been throughout American history on all sides of our most contentious debates. And I thought about the scope of the presidents of the United States who have invoked Hamilton and Jefferson by name, been deep readers of biographies of Hamilton and Jefferson, and often even written biographies of Hamilton and Jefferson. And starting with John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield. In 1912, Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, and William Howard Taft, all three candidates, historians who have written books about Hamilton and Jefferson. And then in the 20th century, Calvin Coolidge, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, JFK, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. All of them are serious students of American history. Regardless on where you come down on all of the great clashes in American history, it is inspiring that our presidents and Supreme Court justices and so many citizens have been deeply engaged with history. Akhil, you taught me to love history and want to share my enthusiasm for it with others. We're both trying to do exactly that in our books. And it is a privilege to study American history through the lens of these great figures, flawed figures, who cared about ideas and whose clashing ideas have continued to frame our debates ever since.
In conclusion, Jeff, I'm just hoping you can say just a few more words, because our time is drawing to an end, about Volume 3 and Union and how you're thinking about that.
I want to tell the story of the forgotten founders who defined the Constitutional Convention and inspired America, and trying to figure out which figures to focus on. It took me a while, but then I just did the obvious thing and asked who spoke most frequently at the convention. And the list begins with Gouverneur Morris, who spoke most frequently.
The lawyer. Lawyers are paid by the word.
Well, absolutely. But aside, and then James Madison, who everyone knows. But in addition to Madison, the most frequent speakers are Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson, Roger Sherman, and then I thought we had to have someone from South Carolina because they were so important in the wicked compromises that enshrine slavery. And I'm going to go with John Rutledge. So with those four figures, Morris, Wilson, Sherman, and Rutledge, I think we can tell the entire story of the convention. There's so many other stories that I can't wait to tell, including just to get people excited about it, contrasting the story of the founder who was murdered with the one who attempted suicide. And that's the story of George Wythe, who was murdered, against John Rutledge, who attempted suicide. And the goal always is to use storytelling to excite people to learn about history. It's such a privilege to be able to study the lives of the founders and how they shaped America. It's a clash of ideas, of ideals, of ambition, of flawed but noble and aspiring people. And I cannot wait for Volume 3, always in an effort to ask, why did they seek union? For what purposes did they fight for union? Under what circumstances were they willing to abandon it? And what can they teach us about union today in this incredibly contested time? And ultimately, of course, all of them, led by Washington, the greatest American and the greatest defender of union, insisted that it's important to set aside our parochial, political, partisan, ego-based interests and bind together for the common good. And it's that common good that is so urgently important for us to recover today. And I hope that our forgotten founders will inspire us to do exactly that.
And in conclusion, Jeff, you want to just remind us in a minute or less what the National Constitution Center, of which you are the president and CEO, is all about, and where it is, and what resources it might have for audience members who want to learn more about you and what you stand for and the center that you run.
Absolutely. I'm here at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia on Independence Mall, across from Independence Hall, with the greatest view of the hall in America. Viewers got to come check it out to be inspired. And you also have to check out our unbelievable online resources. The National Constitution Center is the only institution in America founded by Congress to be nonpartisan in its constitutional education. We've convened the top liberal and conservative scholars and thinkers in America to write about every clause of the Constitution on our interactive Constitution, which Akhil has contributed to. And you can also check out the amazing new interactive Declaration of Independence that we've just posted for America 250. And on that platform, Akhil has annotated the entire Declaration of Independence clause by clause, so you can click on the words created equal and see their antecedents. And you can also find America's greatest historians writing about the big ideas of the Declaration and the Constitution. Robbie George on liberty, Danielle Allen on equality, Gordon Wood on government by consent. You can also find on that toolkit the weekly podcast I host, We the People, which brings together liberals and conservatives to talk about the Constitution, our Constitution 101 courses. It's just a feast of light and learning, and it is such a privilege to convene thinkers for respectful agreement and disagreement. The point of the Constitution is not that we should all reach the same conclusion, but to be committed to civil dialogue. And that's exactly what the National Constitution Center models. We're so excited to take all this great content across America for America 250. And I'm so excited to invite all of you who are watching to be part of this great quest for learning and light.
And speaking of podcasts, audience members should also check out America's Constitution. It's a podcast I have with Andy Lipka. America's Constitution and the We the People podcast, definitely worth your consideration, audience members.
I've so enjoyed this conversation. Conversations about the Constitution have been the great privilege, with you, Akhil, have been the great privilege of my life ever since we started talking about the Constitution so many years ago. And I'm looking forward to many more conversations in the year to come.
Thank you. And just to remind our audience one last time, the book is The Pursuit of Liberty, and the subtitle is How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. And the author is Jeffrey Rosen, who is the president and the CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia.